Nick's heart rate spiked when he saw the man running south. There is most likely at least one expert there, Nick thought. Jenny, take the Specter, Nick shouted, throwing the Specter to Jenny. Jenny caught it, and Nick jumped past her. Continue towards the city, everyone, Nick ordered. I'll keep watch over our back. The team ran at full speed, while Nick ran behind them. Fortunately, his ability had activated again, so no one was looking at him right now. Nick kept looking south as he ran after his team. They were about 4 kilometers from the city's entrance, with a couple of hills between their current location and the entrance. Do not turn around, just keep running, Nick shouted, feeling his ability deactivate after Petra glanced back. Petra quickly turned forward again, still worried for Nick. After a couple of seconds, Nick turned to look at his team. He wanted to make sure that if his ability suddenly deactivated, it wasn't because a teammate was looking at him. 20 seconds later, only 3 kilometers separated them from the bridge. Nick's ability deactivated. Nick looked rapidly in all directions. But there was nobody. He couldn't see anyone looking at him. Do not turn around, Nick shouted. Whoom! A huge ball of light appeared around Nick. The 4 extractors running in front of him felt like everything behind them was being swallowed by light. Nick lost 80% of his Zephyx, making the ball so bright, but now was not the time to save Zephyx. It was worth it. His ability reactivated. As soon as it did, he turned his back to the city and jumped, going backward over his group to a height of nearly 100 meters. At that height, Nick had to be careful not to look at the city accidentally. But it also let him see the person who had just been looking at him. Right now, she was rubbing her eyes furiously. This was why Nick's ability cost so much Zephyx. It had such a strong blinding effect that even veterans and weak experts would lose their eyesight, and standard barriers on the market weren't designed to block this kind of light. Woman from anatomy, standardized MK-45 guns, black hair, at least veteran, Nick shouted as loud as he could, his voice carrying over 2 kilometers. By the time the woman's eyes recovered, she glared at Nick, who was touching the ground again in front of the group. Her hands shook in frustration, then she turned and ran south. This had been Nick's goal. If a dead person loudly announced the appearance of a person moments before they died, it would seem likely that person was the killer. Nick had announced enough of the woman's features that anyone could identify her. Her goal had been to kill Nick. She was one of anatomy's experts, her position high enough that she was involved in several of anatomy's illegal activities. Anatomy was watching Dark Dream closely, and its CZE was one of their main targets. The woman hadn't been interested in the Specter. She'd been here to kill Nick. She had just heard about Nick being outside from the veteran who ran to their infestor. If she'd had time to prepare, she'd have put on a cloak, changed weapons, and stalked the group in silence. But the group was already running back to the city on high alert, so she hadn't had time. And since Nick had just uncovered her, she couldn't kill him anymore. She definitely had the power to kill Nick and his 4 teammates. That would barely take 5 seconds. But what if someone else was present and heard Nick? What if the guards at the city's entrance heard him? His shout had been extremely loud. If Nick suddenly died, everyone would look at her. She'd most likely be found guilty and executed, and Anatomy would receive brutal punishment as well. Even if she were willing to sacrifice herself, killing Nick now would make Anatomy furious. Yes, they wanted Dark Dream, but the risk-to-reward ratio was atrocious right now. At least she hadn't committed to attacking yet. Even if Dark Dream reported her, she could just say she was passing by. Still, one thing severely annoyed her. Lucky bastard, she thought. He used that flash exactly when I was aiming at him. Nick landed in front of the group and looked east, toward where that extractor had aimed at him. Fortunately, nothing happened in the next couple of seconds. When the team was only 2 kilometers from the bridge, they reached a spot visible from the city's entrance. Hey, Nick shouted, waving at the distant guards. Some of them looked at him. They had heard his shout earlier and knew exactly what happened. When they saw the black body Nick was carrying, they knew why someone had targeted them. The guards were not happy to see Nick carrying a Specter. These 4 worked for Anatomy, Kugelblitz, and Ghosty's lab, and would rather have had the Specter in their own companies. But there was nothing they could do. They just watched as Nick's group walked past them into the corridor. Lucky bastard got a Specter, one of them commented. No one answered him. When Nick saw the 2 experts in front of the bridge, he sighed in relief. They were safe now. Chapter 373, Back at Dark Dream. Nick and his employees approached the two guards in front of the bridge calmly. The guards had already noticed them, and when they saw the black body on Nick's shoulders, their eyebrows rose in surprise. "You got another one already?" one of them asked. Nick nodded. "I was lucky," he said, dumping the black body onto the ground. The two guards looked at the body with interest. "What does the Specter do?" one asked. "Nothing related to mentality," Nick said. "It's only physically dangerous, and the Zephyx suppressors around it are still active." He was telling them he wanted to pass without issue. One of the guards looked at the Zephyx suppressors around the Specter. "How strong is it?" "Adolescent," Nick said, "between mid and peak." The two guards still looked at the Specter with surprise. Not that there was a Specter, but that Nick had caught two in less than 2 hours of each other. He had to be insanely lucky. "All right, everything checks out," one of the guards said, gesturing toward the bridge. "You can go." Nick grabbed the Specter and put it over his shoulders again. "Thanks," he said, and walked to the bridge. "You're not getting a third one today, are you?" one of the guards asked. "If I go outside again, I will not return alive," Nick said. The two guards knew what he meant. They used to work for other manufacturers and knew about the hidden conflict. "Understandable," the guard said. Nick and his employees walked across the bridge. When the guards at the inside entrance saw the Specter, their eyebrows rose in surprise. Dark Dream got a Specter. Every manufacturer in the city would know about it within the hour. "We're done for today," Nick told his team when they arrived in front of Dark Dream. "Good work. I expect you back at work in 2 days." The four relaxed noticeably. They'd been quite nervous during the entire excursion, since any of them could have died out there. Their fear hadn't been unfounded. Petra had nearly died, and they'd also been spotted by Anatomy near the end. Luckily, they got what they wanted, 2 Specters. "Thank you, boss," Clayton said in his dark voice. "I'm the one that should thank you," Nick said neutrally. "Big guy, let's grab a drink," Jason shouted with laughter, grabbing Clayton's shoulder. Clayton looked at Jason, his serious expression relaxing a bit. "It's been a while," he said. "I know," Jason shouted. Then he turned to Petra. "Hey, you also want to come?" Petra looked at Jason and thought for a bit. "Of course, just give me a moment," she said. Then she turned to Nick with a serious expression. "Boss, you've saved my life," she said. "Thank you so much. I will repay you someday." "No thanks necessary," Nick said. "Our agreement was that you would be bait and I would protect you. I simply did what was expected of me." A relaxed smile appeared on Petra's face. "Yes, but it still means a lot to me. Not many people would have charged into the darkness to save me. Please, just let me thank you." Nick looked at Petra, and an uncomfortable expression crossed his face. "Okay, sure." Clayton and Jason looked at Nick's expression with shock. Their stone-faced, serious boss could make that kind of expression. When Petra saw Nick's face, she smiled brightly. "Thank you," she repeated. Nick nodded awkwardly, and Petra walked over to Jason and Clayton. Jason shook his head to recover, drinking time. He took the lead and walked toward the inner city. Clayton looked at Petra and gestured to Jason. "All right," Jason shouted, turning around as he walked away. "See you in 2 days, Jenny." Jenny just smiled. "Have fun, see you soon." Petra and Clayton also said their goodbyes before leaving for the inner city. Nick watched them go. "You did well today," Jenny told Nick. Nick didn't say anything, his mind occupied with something else. Jenny looked at him uncertainly. "I'll go talk to Taryn and see if everything's all right. See you later, okay?" she said, approaching Dark Dream's entrance. "Sure, good work," Nick said absent-mindedly. When Jenny saw Nick's uncertain expression, it was like being transported to the past. Back then, Nick had had this expression on his face every day. He had always been so unsure and lively. But over the years, he'd grown quieter and quieter, and 2 years ago, when that thing with the Crimson Sea happened, he changed even more. Jenny wasn't sure she'd heard Nick's genuine laughter within the last 2 years. She also knew he didn't even own a home. He was inside Dark Dream all the time, only working. Did he even have hobbies? Did he have friends? It didn't seem like it. Jenny remembered the early days of Dark Dream with fondness. They weren't rich, but it had felt intimate and warm with just Wintour, Nick, Trevor, and herself. Sadly, things were different now. Trevor and Wintour were dead. All the employees they'd gained from Cycle were dead. Except for Nick, Jenny was now the employee who'd been with the company longest, and it wasn't even close. Thinking about the past put her in a melancholic mood, but then she perked up again. Sure, Wintour and Trevor were dead, but the people who replaced them were just as great. While Taryn seemed much more driven and hungry for acknowledgement than Trevor, he was easy to get along with, and he inspired confidence in others. And Wintour's successor was even better. Julian was Jenny's best friend, and even though they were now boss and employee, their friendship was doing just as great as before. Maybe even better. Chapter 374, Payment Plan. As Jenny walked back into Dark Dream, Nick looked at his 3 distant employees. Petra's words made him feel strange. He genuinely didn't feel like he'd done anything to be proud of. They'd had an agreement, and he'd simply fulfilled his part of it. He had protected his employee. But when Petra had been so thankful, Nick felt unnatural, like he wasn't supposed to be in this situation. People weren't supposed to be thankful to him. He felt like he didn't deserve their thanks. Nick knew he'd done horrible things in the past, and that it was almost impossible to redeem himself. His only hope of redemption was to make Crimson City into a utopia, but the chances of that dream coming true were low. If it happened, Nick felt it would be natural to be showered with thanks and praise. Right now, though, it felt wrong. Even if I saved 1 life today, that doesn't even make a dent in the thousands I owe, Nick thought, taking a deep breath. Breathing was no longer that important for veterans, but Nick still sighed and took deep breaths in stressful or relieving situations out of habit. Nick shook his head, grabbed the Specter, and walked into Dark Dream. Ironically, Petra's words made him feel worse. If she'd said nothing, he'd feel better. Accepting her thanks was like taking something that didn't belong to him. He almost felt guilty. As soon as Nick saw the first mouth on the wall inside Dark Dream, his mood returned to normal. Whenever he was reminded of Julian's existence, he was reminded of his goal as well. Looking at Julian was like looking at his debt and his payment plan at the same time. Nick walked to the 3rd floor, and just as he expected, Julian was already waiting in front of the Specter's future containment unit. "You already got another one," Julian said with a chuckle. Other people might find Julian's chuckle polite and friendly, but in Nick's ears, it just sounded confident and arrogant. He was the only one who knew Julian's true face, and he hated it. Still, he believed Julian was a better fit for leading the city than the current governor. Nick went to the console of the containment unit and opened it. The alarm thundered throughout the building, reminding Nick of the alarm inside the ruin. But right now, the Specter was more important. Several seconds later, the containment unit opened, and Nick threw the Specter in, then closed it again. Done. The Specter was now securely suppressed in the last free containment unit on the 3rd floor. The other 3 containment units on this floor held the Bleeding Lady, the Puppy, and the Money Sink, an entire floor of physical Specters at the adolescent stage. Bleeding Lady is still a mid-adolescent. The Puppy is still an early adolescent. The Money Sink is a late adolescent, but she advanced only recently. This new Specter might be the strongest on this floor, but I don't think it's about to become an adult based on its strength. The Fog and the Lover are mid-adolescents, and the Dung Heap is soon going to become a peak adolescent. None of them will become adults within the next 4 years. The Dreamer is the only one that will advance in that time frame, and only because I had to renegotiate its ratio of Zephyx. But it needs another 2 years or so to become an adult. We really need an adult, Nick thought, looking at the containment unit housing the new Specter. It won't be valuable enough to purchase an adult, but it's at least something. Nick glanced at Julian. Let's hope this piece of information is worth enough. I don't want to stop advancing for several years. I have to talk to you in your office, Julian, Nick said. Julian's human body raised an eyebrow and smiled. Of course, he said. Nick could feel the confidence of his control in Julian's words. The two walked up to the 7th floor and entered his office. Julian sat down behind the desk, and his face transformed into a morphing mass of mouths. Nick showed no reaction to Julian's appearance. This was the ugly face of his actions, and he had to look at it every single day. I presume there's more, the mouth said, appearing and vanishing from Julian's face. Yes, there's more, Nick said. Nick told Julian everything that happened after he left the city the 2nd time. And you risked your life for her, Julian asked, ridiculing. It was our agreement, Nick said. Right, agreement, Julian said, as if he didn't care. Nick knew the word agreement triggered something in Julian. It wasn't trauma, it was annoyance. Julian's entire existence and power relied on bets, which were agreements. He was the only being who couldn't break an agreement without causing significant damage to himself. Naturally, these agreements made him feel stifled, like chains binding him. That was why he had a specific dislike for people who kept their agreements even though they could break them without consequences, like somebody with the freedom to do something who refused to do it. But Julian also knew he shouldn't speak too badly about agreements. After all, he and Nick had won, and he didn't want Nick to think he'd betray and kill him. But Nick already knew. While Julian's acting and mask were perfect outside, he wasn't good at hiding his intentions when the mask was off. It wasn't difficult for Nick to see how much Julian hated keeping agreements. "And then I noticed something," Nick said, recounting what happened. "There was some light coming from behind some of the silk, and that light worked against the nightmare's influence." Chapter 375, The Old World. When Nick started talking about the steel door, Julian became very interested. Nick could tell Julian was enraptured by the story because his mouths were no longer flowing smoothly, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. This happened because Julian was no longer focusing on appearing beautiful and mesmerizing. "And you went inside?" Julian asked. Nick nodded. "What did you find?" Nick told Julian about the piles of dust, the weapons, the steel armor, and so on. There was one thing he kept secret, what he'd seen on the monitors. Those things were going to be seen by Aegis, humanity's biggest shield. Nick was willing to tell Julian about the building and what it contained, but not about the information from there. Julian might have suspected Nick wasn't telling him everything, but that thought didn't even occur to him since Nick dropped a bigger bomb. A machine that made Zephyx. Even if Nick kept something secret, it wouldn't be nearly as big as this. "A machine that produces Zephyx?" Julian asked. "Correct," Nick said. "At least that's my assumption. I couldn't make sense of any of it." "I wouldn't expect you to," Julian said with a chuckle. "From what you've told me, this ruin belongs to the old world." Nick was surprised. He hadn't expected Julian to know something about the ruins. "The old world?" he asked. Julian chuckled. "The first world. You've seen the ruins below the city, right?" Nick nodded. "The first layer of ruins is built on another layer, which is built on another layer. Each layer has different materials and a different architectural style." Julian chuckled again. "You remember Albert, your mentor. He was part of a team that worked on learning about past civilizations. I know all this from talking to him and his colleagues. Apparently, there are tens of thousands of years of history buried beneath Crimson City. Civilizations upon civilizations rose and fell here. And as far as I can tell, the ruin you visited came from the old world, the oldest civilization we know of. The old world is one of incomprehensible technological advancement, but also unprecedented weakness." Nick's brows rose. "How is that possible?" Julian chuckled some more. "Because Specters didn't exist back then. At least that's the theory." "Specters didn't exist," Nick repeated in shock. "A world without Specters? How?" Nick's first thought went to the sun. The sun was a Specter, right? So how was the world back then? Completely dark. And with no nightmare, was everyone just okay with living in darkness? Did people even need eyes? Then Nick remembered the lamps in the ruin. Right, since they didn't have light back then, they had to make their own. "A world without Specters," Nick repeated in his mind. That seemed absurd. Specters seemed just as eternal as humanity. Tens of thousands of years, such a long time. What had happened back then? That explains why everything was made of steel, Nick thought. Without Specters, there's no Zephyx, and without Zephyx, no Zephyx materials. Wait, but they had Zephyx. They had this machine. With Zephyx, they should also have had access to powerful materials, and the humans should have been more powerful. But they weren't. Nick's mind filled with contradictions. Nothing made sense. "The technologies from the old world are incomparably advanced," Julian said. Albert and his team looked at them, and for most, they couldn't even tell what they were used for. Nobody in the city has a clue how old-world technology works. The only things that make sense are their normal guns. We know how those work. But the parts needed to construct these guns are so incredibly precise, it would take an expert years to learn to make one. And every gun would take days or weeks of focused manufacturing. And for what? A gun that loses its effect on level 2 extractors." Julian chuckled again. "The old world is mystical. I'm not surprised it found a way to create Zephyx, but I am surprised you found such a machine." Nick was still lost in thought. So many things didn't make sense. "Why did you tell me?" Julian asked. Nick looked up. "Because I don't want to die." Oh, Julian said. You think you wouldn't be able to hide it and that I'd kill you for keeping it secret? No, Nick said. It's not you killing me, it's the governor. Julian remained silent, then began to chuckle. Apparently he found Nick's logic amusing, though he didn't say why. Interesting, Julian said. You fear the governor wants to silence you if you tell him. So you told me first so I can tell him, since I don't need to fear such retaliation. Nick nodded. Also, the information about the ruins' location is probably worth quite a bit. It sure is, Julian answered. I can get quite a bit out of this. Aegis is very interested in ruins from the old world and cities have to report if they find one. Aegis will most likely send people to look into the ruin, and the city definitely gets something out of this. Julian chuckled yet again. It was smart of you to tell me, since you wouldn't be able to make use of this information, but I can. Chapter 376, Asking for a Meeting. Nick walked past the guards and entered the inner city. He and Julian had talked just a couple of minutes ago, and Julian had sent him to schedule a meeting with the governor. Because of anatomy, Julian still couldn't leave Dark Dream. Nick walked past the happy people in the inner city and approached the Central Administration Building, the hub for citizens who wanted to talk to the city's administration. He walked past the two Johns guarding the door and entered. Inside, two counters were manned by normal people employed by the city, both busy. From what Nick could hear, one person was talking about marriage, another about a land dispute. In front of the city, everyone was equal, normal people and extractors both had to wait. At least, that was how it was portrayed outside. Nick waited 5 minutes for a counter to free up, then approached. The middle-aged lady behind it looked at him with a polite smile, rather funny since she'd talked to the previous people in a bored, annoyed tone. She'd seen Nick was a veteran and didn't want to offend someone this powerful. "Welcome, how may I help you?" she asked warmly. "My name is Nick, and I'm the chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream," he said. The woman's eyes widened. A chief Zephyx Extractor. She'd never talked to one before. CZEs basically all lived in the upper layer of the inner city, which had its own administration office. Someone working down here never got to talk to someone with such high status. "And I need to schedule a meeting with the governor," Nick added. Her eyes widened again and she took a deep breath. People asked about meeting the governor all the time and none of them got one. But this was a chief Zephyx Extractor. Could he get a meeting? She wasn't sure. Offices like this worked with set processes, and the process for requesting a meeting with the governor was a flat refusal. Someone from the lower layer of the inner city couldn't be important enough, but this was a CZE. "Could you please wait a moment?" she asked, standing. "I need to consult my superior." Nick nodded. She left and entered a different office. Over a minute passed. Eventually she returned with someone else, a smaller man with black hair, wearing the uniform of a John working directly for the city. "Hello, my name is Johansson Mithras, and I'm the department head," the man said. "You are Dark Dream's chief Zephyx Extractor." "I am," Nick said. "Good. Are you asking for a meeting or is Dark Dream?" "Dark Dream," Nick said. "Just to be sure, you have the authority to represent Dark Dream." "I own 40% of Dark Dream," Nick said, "and I was sent by the person owning the other 60%. "Julian Wright," the man said with a smile. "I know him." Nick only nodded. "All right, that should qualify for a meeting," Johansson said. "Excuse me, I haven't done this process before. It might take a while." "No problem," Nick said. Nick waited in silence as Johansson looked through several sheets of paper. Minutes passed. "How urgent is it?" Johansson asked, still searching. "On a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not urgent at all and 5 is an imperative security risk to the public." Nick furrowed his brows. "I'd say 3. I'm quite sure the governor would want to meet us sooner rather than later." Dark Dream's CEO, Julian Nerger, wants to meet him inside Dark Dream's building. Due to some matters, he can't leave right now. Johansson seemed uncertain. "I'm not sure that's going to work." "Just tell him Julian wants to meet him," Nick said. "He will come." "Well, okay, but I can't promise anything," Johansson said. "I'll send the request up to the upper layer. I don't know how long it'll take to process. Could be minutes, could be days. I'll send someone to Dark Dream when we know more, okay?" "Sure," Nick answered. The two said their goodbyes, and Nick went back to Dark Dream. When he entered, he noticed an absence of mouths on the walls. Julian knew the governor might appear at some point, and having his mouths all over the walls was a bad look. Nick told Julian what he'd discussed with the administrator and returned to work. There was nothing to do but wait. Luckily, just 2 hours later, they got their answer. A tall man with black hair stepped into Dark Dream's building. He seemed a bit annoyed that the building was angled to the side. That seemed quite unsafe. He walked up to the receptionist, whose eyes went wide. Was that the governor? The governor was here. She didn't even say her practiced line, just stared at him in shock. Julian wanted to meet me, the governor said neutrally. Marcus, you came. The governor, Marcus Julius, looked toward the staircase. Julian stood there, smile plastered on his face. Marcus had met Julian a couple of times, but they'd never had the time for a proper conversation. One of them had always been in a rush. Julian, Marcus said in greeting. The governor wasn't offended by Julian using his first name. Outside of big meetings, he was fine with specialists and heroes calling him by his first name. Please come up to my office. I have some good news. The governor raised an eyebrow. Good news? That was rare. Chapter 377, Private Meeting. I'm glad we finally found time to talk, Julian said, leading Marcus up the staircase. Agreed, the governor said. Your absence during the big meetings might not raise many eyebrows, but people might start to suspect things if you keep being absent. Julian laughed in discomfort. Yes, I know, sorry. It's just very difficult right now given Dark Dream's status. If I leave, some random expert from a manufacturer might come free our Specters. Neither of us wants that. Marcus didn't seem surprised. He knew exactly what was going on, that all the manufacturers were essentially warring with each other in secret. Sadly, there wasn't much he could do about it. The only thing was to make it illegal and punish whoever was caught, raising the risk of attacking, but that couldn't stop them. The only way to truly stop the attacks was to increase surveillance, but that would anger the manufacturers, since it would make breaking the law extremely difficult, and every manufacturer was breaking the law in some way. If he tried too hard to catch every illegal thing going on, the manufacturers might work together to dethrone him. Marcus was most likely the strongest extractor in the city, with Arya Light his only competitor, but not even he could resist 4 heroes attacking him at once. So it was important to give the manufacturers some freedom. As long as they had room to compete, they wouldn't risk attacking the city's government. Marcus knew Anatomy was watching Dark Dream closely, but he couldn't publicly acknowledge that. He was supposed to uphold the law, and if people realized he was secretly letting crimes go, they'd call it corruption. They reached Dark Dream's 7th floor and found Nick waiting in front of Julian's office. Marcus nodded to Nick in greeting. Nick nodded politely back. Julian opened the door and walked inside. Marcus followed. Nick entered last and closed the door while Marcus and Julian sat down. Then he grabbed a chair and moved it behind Julian's desk. Usually he sat face to face with Julian, but this time he sat side by side. Coffee? Julian asked with a bright smile. No, I don't have the time. Please tell me the reason for the meeting, Marcus said neutrally. Julian just smiled more. Nick has stumbled upon a ruin from the old world, he said directly. Marcus's eyes shone and he looked immediately at Nick. Is that true? He asked, serious. I do not know if it is from the old world, Nick said, but I told Julian and Julian thinks it is. What have you seen in there? Everything was made of normal steel, Nick said. There were guns that made no sound but burned holes into steel walls, many piles of dust, very advanced displays everywhere. The governor narrowed his eyes, and a machine that produces Zephyx, Nick said. The governor's eyes narrowed further. How many people know of this? Nick grew nervous, but Julian's confident demeanor reassured him. Only the people in this room, he said. Is that true? Marcus asked again. Nick nodded. Marcus studied him for a couple of seconds. Nick didn't falter. Marcus took a deep breath and sighed. That's good. It's important that very few people know of these things. How come? Julian asked casual. The governor glanced at him, not expecting the question. Why all this secrecy? Julian asked. People can't make sense of old-world technology anyway, and the more people know, the better. From the times we've talked, you seem to have some altruistic characteristics. Wouldn't you want people to know? The governor tried to figure out Julian's goal. Was he calling out hypocrisy, a veiled threat, some kind of scheme? But when he looked at Julian, he saw only casual curiosity. Julian genuinely wanted to know. Even though the governor talked regularly with many specialists, they stayed respectful and formal around him. Julian was respectful too, but more personal and forward than the others, like they were old friends, though deep respect was still audible in his words. It was as if they'd been colleagues for years, though they'd talked for fewer than 5 minutes total. Julian wasn't breaking protocol, but his manner was something the governor otherwise only experienced with the 4 other heroes of Crimson City. Marcus didn't dislike talking to Julian. It was a bit refreshing. The governor had been talking to people for over 200 years, and he was confident in his ability to unveil hidden intentions. He was fairly sure Julian was just curious. Either that or he's the best manipulator I've ever encountered, the governor thought. There's no harm in telling them anyway. He looked at Nick, who looked back respectfully. You're right, the governor said. It's better if people knew about the old world. Maybe a genius among the common people could decipher something and advance humanity. But it's impossible. Chapter 378, The Envious Researcher. How come? Julian asked, curious. It's not exactly a secret, but it's better if people don't know about this, the governor said. The less people know about adversaries, the less fear they feel. Nick furrowed his brows, so an adversary was involved. The envious researcher is one of the adversaries opposing humanity, the governor said. Aegis isn't certain if it has a personal vendetta against humanity or if its way of growing stronger inherently makes it our enemy. It's not responsible for many deaths, but its impact on humanity is probably among the greatest of all the adversaries. The governor looked forward with severity, his eyes unfocused. Whenever a significant advancement in technology is produced, the envious researcher is attracted. If only a handful of people know about it, the attraction is weak, but once the number reaches double digits, things become very dangerous. If, say, you told several people about the Zephyx machine, the envious researcher would almost certainly show up and completely destroy it. Nick looked at the governor with surprise, and the people who know about it. The governor glanced at him, and Nick felt he'd spoken out of turn. It depends how much they know, the governor said. If they only know it exists, nothing happens. But if they know how it works, the envious researcher will destroy them too. It grows more powerful by stopping humanity's technological advancement. Anyone developing new technology is in constant danger from it. Every new technology has to be kept secret, known only by a handful. To publicize it, we have to get past the stage of attraction. That's usually done by producing hundreds or thousands of products with the advancement built in, distributing them across many cities in secret, then simultaneously teaching thousands of people worldwide. If enough people know how it works, and it's too difficult to eliminate, the envious researcher stops trying to stop it. Sadly, publicizing an advancement this way consumes enormous resources, and many people still die during the initial lessons. Teaching the public about technology is extremely dangerous. Luckily, you didn't tell more people, the governor told Nick. Otherwise, the machine would probably already be destroyed. Is there no way to deal with it? Nick asked. I'm not privy to those things, the governor said. Aegis views the envious researcher as one of its greatest enemies, but a mere hero isn't someone who gets involved in such matters. Nick nodded, showing he didn't intend to ask more. Where is the ruin? The governor asked. Nick blinked, uncomfortable. Slurp. Julian drank some coffee and sighed with relaxation. Marcus furrowed his brows in annoyance. You will get an adequate reward, the governor said. Julian smiled brightly and turned to Nick. Nick, could you please lead our governor to the ruin? Of course, Nick said, standing. Marcus stood too. Oh, Marcus, one more thing, Julian said. Marcus turned a bit annoyed. What? I have something else that might interest the city, not as important as the ruin. When you're done there, could you come back so I can show you? What's this about? A specter with a peculiar ability. Based on some theories, it might help against the forests, and might even weaken the Crimson Sea, though that second part isn't certain yet. The governor was interested, but the ruin came first. I'll come back later, Marcus said, walking out while Nick held the door. Julian just smiled. Nick led the governor out of Dark Dream, running at high speed. The governor kept pace with no issue. Surprisingly, the people they passed didn't notice the governor. Not even the guards looked at him. With enough power and experience, Zephyx could be used for many purposes. Nick regularly used it to quiet the impact of landing after a jump. Someone as powerful as the governor probably had no trouble using his to stay hidden. Just run past them, the governor said as they approached the bridge. Usually Nick had to identify himself when leaving, but this time he didn't. He ran past the guards, and none of them so much as blinked. Even the 2 experts on the other side didn't seem to notice him. Nick's anticipation lessened. What if an extractor from anatomy attacked him while the governor was right there? That would have been perfect, but the governor hid Nick from the outside too. They left the corridor and ran east. A bit more than a minute later, they reached the foot of the mountain. "It's in there?" the governor asked. Nick nodded. "How did you find out there's a ruin in there?" "We were attacked by a specter," Nick said, telling the governor what happened as they jumped toward the hole. "You jumped into the darkness to save your employee?" the governor asked, brows furrowed. Nick nodded and jumped into the hole. The governor watched him go with an interested glint in his eyes, then jumped after him. Chapter 379, Answers. Nick landed in the middle of the cave, inside the darkness. The nightmare had already become active again. But its influence vanished quickly as the governor landed beside him, giving off a bit of light, looking at Nick expectantly. Nick was surprised the governor could create light without any noticeable device. Does he create light just by manipulating Zephyx? Nick thought. Isn't that how Zephyx synchronizers work, copying the way a Specter uses its Zephyx? So if someone knows exactly how an ability works and can manipulate their Zephyx finely enough, couldn't they use that ability without a matching synchronizer? Though I can't imagine how difficult that would be, like running while manually commanding every strand of muscle in my body. "I'm using Zephyx manipulation," the governor said, noticing Nick staring. "Please hurry, it's costly to keep producing this light." "Oh right, sorry," Nick said, running down the cave with the governor following. A couple of seconds later they arrived at the door Nick had destroyed. The alarm was still blaring, the light still pulsing. The governor's eyes narrowed. "Lead me around," he ordered. "Of course," Nick said. They entered, and Nick showed him the steel suits in the lockers. The governor stepped forward and studied them closely. "Why are the suits so weak and the weapons so strong?" Nick asked over the alarm. The governor furrowed his brows without looking away, seemingly thinking something through. Then, without a word, he set the suit down and went to the other room. Nick watched him take one of the powerful rifles, pointed at a suit, and pull the trigger. SSSS. Several spots on the walls began to sizzle, but the suit showed no damage. Nick's eyes widened. How was this possible? He could tear these suits apart easily, but the guns were an actual threat to him, yet the suits resisted them without issue. "Do you know how people in the outer city cook?" the governor asked. Nick was taken aback by the question. "Yes, they focus the light." That was when he understood. "Wait, this is light." The governor nodded. "Correct. And the shell of this suit is made of something that disperses light. The only way through is physical force, without extractors, high-caliber rifles. We believe the light rifles were used to break through barricades and kill humans not wearing these suits. We can see what these weapons accomplish, and somewhat understand how the suits defend against them, but we have no idea how the weapons condense this much light using so little energy, or how to produce the material that resists it. We know it's possible. That's the extent of what we know." Nick nodded, looking at the suit with newfound respect. I didn't expect him to answer at all, let alone tell me this much, Nick thought. The governor then asked Nick to show him more of the ruin. "Remains of a deceased old one," he said, seeing one of the piles of dust. "Have you noticed something about them?" Nick was surprised by the question. He was only supposed to show the governor around. But now the governor was showing him things, and asking questions he probably already knew the answers to. "Their placement seems very organized," Nick said. "Most are in places you'd find humans above beds, guarding doors in front of monitors. Only a few were in random places. I suspect they were killed instantly, unprepared for death." "That's correct," the governor said, picking up one of the small squares lying in a pile. "It's like this in every ruin of the old ones as far as I know." He tapped both sides of the square and shook off the dust. "We think the old ones all died simultaneously, without warning." He searched the pile until he found a long cord. "Every old one in the world died at the same time. We don't know who or what did it." He fit the cord into the square, then walked to a wall, searching for something. "Our most likely suspect is the sun." Nick's eyes widened. The sun. He knew it was incredibly powerful, but he hadn't expected it could kill every human in the world simultaneously without any of them reacting. Could Nurse Alice do this too? Could the nightmare? It didn't seem likely. Nurse Alice always showed up personally. By now Nick knew enough about Specters and Extractors to understand how she managed to arrive so quickly whenever anyone said the sentence. It was actually simple, not an illusion, teleportation, or domain. Nurse Alice was just very fast, Very, very fast. Chapter 380, Champion of Light. The difference in power between a common man and Nick was staggering. Even without his ability, Nick was around 150 times more powerful than his base physical body. He could jump over a kilometer, run faster than 200 kph, lift things over 10 tons. And he was only an early veteran. The gap between a normal person and an early veteran was the same order of magnitude as the gap between an early veteran and a mid-specialist. A mid-specialist could clear over 50 kilometers in a single jump. Their speed would have to be measured in kilometers per second. They could lift over 1,000 tons. The same jump in magnitude happened again going from mid-specialist to late protector. The power of such a person was unimaginable. And again from late protector to the power of the Eternals. Nurse Alice could probably move thousands of kilometers per second. She could lift millions of tons. If someone on the other side of the world spoke the sentence, she'd need barely a couple of seconds to arrive. Nurse Alice was unimaginably powerful. And yet, could she kill every human in the world at once? She could probably obliterate a city with a single strike, jump to the next, and do the same, maybe destroy a couple of cities in a second like that. But that would be the extent of her power. She couldn't do what the sun had done. What about the nightmare? There was an important distinction between physical power and ability. The nightmare's influence was its ability, but the nightmare itself had to be present in a certain location. It could jump from city to city and destroy them, like Nurse Alice, but encompassing the entire world while ignoring sunlight was most likely too much for it. So the nightmare couldn't accomplish what the sun had done either. The maw, most likely a physical specter, even if theorized to be huge, it couldn't be everywhere at once. The null, not much was known, but since it was possible to see it, as Nick's lost memories and his own ability proved, it was most likely also a physical specter. Maybe it had some ability to erase anyone who knew about it, but that put it on the same level as the nightmare. Most likely it couldn't do this either. The sun. What kind of ability did the sun have? Where was its body? The sun was in the sky, above everyone at all times. No matter where, no matter when, it was omnipresent. And if it was present, it could probably act on whoever was in its presence. Could it kill every human in the world? Most likely. Is that its ability? Nick thought. Is the sun we always see its true body or just part of its ability? Is the sun actually the sun? The other Eternals all need certain conditions to use their powers. Someone has to say the sentence. A certain number of people need to reach a certain level. Someone has to be in the darkness. Someone has to know something about you. What about the sun? Does its power have conditions, or can it use its power however it wants? Nick had been staring at the ground for a while as the governor kept tapping the square in his hands. Neither of them said anything. After a bit, Nick glanced at him, unsure. Why was the governor telling him all this? If he wants to kill me, I'm already dead. No point being afraid of asking too much, Nick thought. Does the sun have an activation condition for its ability? He asked. The governor didn't answer immediately. Have you heard the story of the Champion of Light? No, Nick said. The governor stopped tapping and turned to look at him, brows furrowed. Nick just looked back normally. Is this some kind of joke? No, Nick said. Should I have heard of it? The governor looked at him like he couldn't believe it. That's very unusual. The story of the Champion of Light is told to every child. A short story about a champion who is the manifestation of every despairing human's dreams and hopes. The more people wish for a brighter tomorrow, the more powerful he becomes. Eventually, when humanity is at its lowest point, the dreams of the despairing reach a crescendo, and the Champion of Light gains the power to destroy the sun and replace it with himself. His eternal light banishes the nightmare, incinerates Nurse Alice, seals up the maw, and vanquishes the null, ushering in a new age of prosperity and hope. Parents tell this story to make their children's lives a bit more magical. Nick wasn't sure why the governor was talking about a fairy tale, but I've never heard of it. Which is why I was so surprised, the governor said. The story's been deliberately designed to be easy to remember, like, and retell. It's a classic. Aegis created it, and it has a real purpose, because the Champion of Light is real. Nick's eyes widened. Chapter 381, The Strongest Human. Wait, what? Nick asked. It's not a fairy tale. It is a fairy tale, the governor said. All that about replacing the sun and vanquishing the Eternals is just story, but the Champion of Light himself is real. He's humanity's champion, the leader of Aegis, and the strongest human that exists. Nick felt like his mind had been hit by a bombshell. The strongest human, the leader of Aegis. He's the only human with a Zephyx synchronizer attuned to the sun, the governor said. Attuned to the sun, that was possible. That's even crazier than being attuned to the null, Nick thought. Several thoughts shot through his mind. So he has the sun's ability. He thought of the story again. He takes all the hopes of despairing humans and ushers in a new tomorrow. The story's been designed to be memorable and easy to retell, so Aegis spread it. The more people who know about it, the better. Does the champion of light gain power from people believing in him? And if he has the sun's power, doesn't that mean the sun has the same activation condition? Does that mean the sun gains power by being seen and known by people? Nick asked. You're quite fast, the governor said. Yes, Aegis believes the sun's power is the opposite of the null's. The null doesn't want to be seen by anyone. The sun wants to be seen by everyone. Aegis even suspects the sun had a hand in the nightmare's creation. Where there is darkness, there is no sun. The more dangerous the darkness, the more people want to be in the sun, and the more they're in the sun, the more attention they pay it. The champion of light grows more powerful the more people know him and think about him. Years ago, Aegis constantly posted pictures of him in every city, reminding everyone. Ironically, that made people annoyed, then made them hate him, which made them stop putting their hopes in him. The damage was devastating. He was weakened during that time. I still remember it. Eventually, they just told the cities to spread the fairy tale instead. The older people who remembered the pictures got annoyed, but the young enjoyed the story. It became normal. Now only older extractors remember the time before it. The story's shown remarkable success. Today the champion of light is at his most powerful. The only reason humanity's greatest enemies haven't eradicated us is his presence. The enemy adversaries can only wage guerrilla warfare, poke us and hide. None can fight him alone. If they banded together, they might have a shot. But Specters are inherently selfish. They'd rather keep growing at their normal rate than risk their lives like that. And time is on their side. The governor fell silent for a while. The champion of light doesn't have much longer to live. He's an ancient man now, the oldest in existence. He'll die within this century. The governor frowned. We don't know if we can resist the adversaries when that happens. Nick's heart rate had been elevated for a while. What the governor was telling him was crazy, like being told about the approaching end of humanity. Is there nothing humanity can do? Nick asked. I don't know, the governor said. I know of the problem, but not what Aegis is doing to solve it. What I'm telling you is known by everyone involved with Aegis. None of it is secret. It's simply discouraged to tell people outside Aegis, since it could start a panic that benefits no one. Nick looked at the governor, unsure. Sure, these weren't secrets, but it was still strange that the governor took the time to tell him. Why are you telling me about these things? Nick asked. The governor looked at him, then back at the square in his hand, tapping it some more. Because of how Simon Francium treated you after your conversation with him, he said. Nick was reminded of Simon Francium, the protector who talked with him after Nick met Envy. Nick had told Simon about his power, fully expecting to be put to death. Instead, he'd received a foreign piece of Zephyx he could use to end his own life instantly. In the end, Simon made sure nothing happened to Nick, and that he was properly compensated for his services. He just doesn't usually get involved in a city's local politics, the governor said. The fact that Simon made sure you were properly rewarded was very unlike a representative of Aegis. It's obvious Aegis is interested in you and most likely keeping an eye on you. I don't know what you talked about or why they're interested, but they are. In some way, you're involved with Aegis, and that's good for both of us. Every governor of every city is also an agent of Aegis. City governance is up to the governor, but the purpose of a city's existence is to further humanity's power and survival. That means we're working for the same team. It means we're allies. Chapter 382, Strong Leader. Allies? Nick didn't know what to think of that word. The governor had told him a lot about the world, but these were things too distant to grasp easily. Looking at the bigger picture, one could see where he was coming from. Humanity needed the champion of light. The cities existed to further humanity's survival and strength. All governors were agents of Aegis, and Aegis's goal was to protect humanity. The Specters were extremely dangerous, and all of Aegis had to work together against them. But doesn't that sound way too pure and one-sided? Nick thought. All of humanity working together, everyone acting in humanity's best interest. Images from his past surfaced. People who couldn't pay the blood tax, turned into husks by the mosquitoes. Extractors killing whomever they wanted from the dregs for a few credits. Manufacturers squeezing every bit of money they could from normal people. For the good of humanity, Nick repeated in his mind, with abhorrent disgust. The governor's words sounded idealistic, and he was persuasive, good at convincing people of his viewpoint. Maybe Nick would have bought it, if not for Simon Francium. Simon Francium had told Nick things he'd never forget. No organization is without internal conflict, and Aegis is no exception, Nick recalled. Many protectors are forced to fight for humanity. Without the shields keeping them suppressed, most would just stay inside a city and remain normal extractors. They wouldn't even try to fight specters that view humanity as an enemy. They'd only care about catching demons and normal fallen to grow their power and their pockets. Meanwhile, the governor talks like Aegis is one unit, and whatever it does is for the good of humanity. He talks like he thinks of me as an ally, like he's doing his best to support humanity as a whole. Yet he's willing to raise the blood tax, sucking dry many people and children just so Cugelblitz gets a single-digit profit increase. He never pushed to remove the parasite, just spoke empty words of encouragement. He talks about debilify, a disease that makes life unlivable, but doesn't truly try to find its source. Everybody knows one of the manufacturers has a secret specter that gains power by spreading debilify. Everyone in the big meeting knows that, and yet he just says we need to find a cure and a cause. He never does anything about it. Simon Francium doesn't even trust him. Instead of tasking the governor with finding Envy's secret servant, he tasked a random John, me. The most important thing Simon said was that Aegis forces compliance on all protectors. Without Aegis's iron fist, humanity would be fragmented and weak. And isn't this city exactly what a world without Aegis would look like? The governor tries to work with the manufacturers, giving them leeway on some things, expecting compliance on others. Nick felt deep revulsion. Why should a murderer be allowed to commit 2 murders a year just so he doesn't commit 10? He shouldn't be allowed to commit any. If he doesn't comply, he dies. The good of humanity and the community rule above all. You can't focus a group of people on a common goal without forcing them. The governor is a weak leader. I am not on his side. I am on Aegis's side. Humans are inherently selfish. Give several people the power to decide humanity's path, and that path will inevitably lead to their bellies growing fat and their pockets heavy. Humanity needs a strong, selfless leader, and from what the governor and Simon Francium said, the champion of light is that leader. He forces the protectors to protect humanity or die, and only lets people he believes in become shields. Aegis is the reason humanity still stands. If Nick hadn't learned so much from Julian over the past 2 years, his face would have shown obvious disgust. As it stood, he looked at the governor with his usual respectful eyes. You're not part of Aegis, Nick thought. You're someone working for Aegis, acting like a paragon of humanity, but really just protecting your own position and wealth by not offending anyone who could threaten your life. You cling so hard to your life and wealth that you don't dare do anything Cugelblitz or Anatomy wouldn't want. Why don't you actually look for the hidden Specter in Anatomy or Cugelblitz yourself? So what if they go crazy and do horrible things? If they do, you kill them. Many lives will end in the process, but that can't be avoided. The people in the present might resent you, but future generations will call you a hero. If you want to cut out the decaying flesh in your torso, you'll inevitably cut some healthy pieces too. You think I'm your ally? Nick asked in surprise. Your connection with Aegis suggests so, the governor said, nodding. Are you not? Nick nodded. I am on Aegis's side. The governor sighed. I'm glad to hear that. You don't seem to be lying. Silence. Nick, would you be interested in working for the city? Chapter 383, Democratic Soldiers. The only things Nick felt at that proposal were disgust, annoyance, and disdain. If I worked under you, the people of Crimson City would have nobody left who has their best interest at heart, he thought. Nick acted taken aback. Wait a second, he said after 2 seconds of stunned silence. I have to think about this. Take your time, the governor said, putting the square away and walking to the door. I don't need you to show me around anymore. I've got a map now. Nick watched with surprise as he left. Several seconds later, Nick began pacing, brows furrowed, seeming to debate with himself. But why wasn't it already certain he'd refuse? Yes, however. His ability hadn't reactivated. Someone or something was watching him, and Nick was fairly sure it was the governor. Spying on me, huh? Nick thought, looking at the wall thoughtfully. Not sure how, but I guess he has some unique powers. He kept pacing, occasionally whispering to himself. Is this some kind of test? Does he want to make sure I'm not planning to betray him? I can't be sure. I just have to act like I'm deliberating. After about a minute, Nick sighed, looked at the door, and exited. He walked slowly through the hallway, glancing into every room for the governor, and finally found him in the big room with all the screens. "Have you made your decision?" the governor asked without turning around, his voice somehow cutting through the alarm. Nick took a deep breath. "I don't think joining the city is what I should do," he said slowly. The governor turned, evaluating him. "Elaborate, please." "I'm on Aegis's side," Nick said. "Ever since I talked with Simon Francium, I've known Aegis is the one organization I want to help more than any other. You said the cities exist to ultimately help humanity, but joining the city isn't the best way to help Aegis or the city." A gleam of interest appeared in the governor's eyes, but he said nothing. "Dark Dream has grown a lot these past years," Nick said. "More Specters, more Extractors, a bigger investigation department, more clerks. Our profit margins have grown too. And while I can't say we're perfectly clean, the stains on our shirts are minuscule. We haven't influenced politics for our own gain. We haven't used the guards to hide wrongdoing. We aren't secretly harboring Specters we shouldn't. We aren't killing people without telling the city. Whenever there's been conflict, we haven't been the aggressors, only defended ourselves. Dark Dream has had many opportunities over the years, but Julian and I have never taken more than we were owed." "The other manufacturers are not like that," Nick said coldly. The governor kept looking at him. "I don't need to tell you what they do. You know better than me. The fact is, Dark Dream isn't nearly as parasitic to the city as the others. That's why I think staying with Dark Dream is the right thing. The guards and the government are shackled by laws, with little freedom to act. Dark Dream has all the freedom. There, I can support Aegis better than as a city agent." The governor looked unimpressed. "You believe the government is ineffective in enforcing its laws?" Nick met his eyes. "With 10 specialists, 20 experts, and 40 veterans, would it have been possible to remove the parasite's influence in the past?" The governor furrowed his brows, studying him for a while. Nick just looked back. "The answer is no, it wouldn't have," Nick continued. The governor was surprised. "With that kind of force, it should have been possible." "Because most of the city's forces are borrowed," Nick said. "At least one, if not several, of the people assigned to the mission would have deliberately overlooked many of the rats. The guards don't belong to the city at most, they're temps. Their true loyalties lie with the manufacturers, not the city. So yes, I believe the city can't properly enforce its laws, because most of its people are criminals themselves." As the governor looked at Nick, the image of him in his mind changed. Nick had always seemed inexperienced and naive to the governor. His only real virtues his altruism and his power relative to his level. But the confidence in his words made the governor realize he might have underestimated him. Nick had highlighted the city's biggest flaw. It didn't have many Specters, so it couldn't produce many Extractors truly loyal to it. Having to borrow Extractors from manufacturers was why it was so hard to keep them in check. While the head of government was, technically, a dictator, all his soldiers and guards acted according to democracy, a democracy in which only big companies could vote. Logically, the big companies voted for what was best for the big companies, and many times that broke the laws the dictator had set. Chapter 384, Horde. "I see," the governor said after a while. "A shame." Nick wasn't sure why he'd worded it like that. He was sure he'd made his point well, and the governor should have voiced agreement or disagreement, but he just brushed all of it off. "I'm sorry," Nick said. "Silence." Nick stood near the entrance without moving, feeling a bit awkward, but there wasn't much he could do about it. If he ran back to the city alone, he might run into someone from anatomy again and get killed. The governor had brought him here, and Nick wasn't leaving without him. He didn't want to die. For the next 10 minutes, the governor looked through the monitors, pressing buttons now and then, while Nick waited in silence. Eventually, the governor walked to the entrance and motioned for Nick to follow. They walked wordlessly to the building's entrance. The governor began shining with light again and ran toward the hole. They climbed out, Nick making sure not to accidentally look toward the city. Then the governor stopped beside the hole. "You think you and Dark Dream are different?" he asked. Nick didn't answer immediately. The tone made clear it was rhetorical. "Dark Dream is just like every other manufacturer," the governor said calmly. "You might have broken fewer laws than the others, but that doesn't mean you're different." He looked at Nick, who couldn't look back without risking a glimpse of the Crimson Sea. "In my experience, someone who forgoes an opportunity for personal profit only does so because they see an opportunity for even more profit later. The ones who act the most innocent are often the worst. If you're genuinely only trying to help, prove it with your actions over the coming years. Until then, you're no different from the other manufacturers. The next moment, Nick felt like he was levitating. Whoom! The world spun in his eyes, chaos everywhere. Ding! That was when his back touched something hard. Nick still didn't dare open his eyes and just felt the thing behind him. Metal, a long solid sheet of it. Then he heard people talking. Nick opened his eyes and looked around. He was in Crimson City, lying on the street in front of Dark Dream's building. The governor had thrown him back into the city. I didn't even feel like I moved. Nick stood and looked toward the mountain, though he couldn't see it through the wall of red mist. The ones that act the most innocent are often the worst ones, he repeated in his mind, brushing dust off his uniform. From his viewpoint, maybe that's true for Dark Dream. Our goal is to take over the city. But the only people who don't benefit from that are the big manufacturers and the governor himself, everyone who currently has a hand in running the city. Are we the worst ones for wanting to stage a coup, even if it's for the good of the people? Nick jumped back to Dark Dream and entered. Just another fat old man sitting on his hill of valuables, deathly afraid of hands reaching for his hoard. When he entered, the mouths were still absent from the walls. Julian was probably still being careful, since the governor might return any moment. Nick went to Julian's office and told him how it had gone. Why did you not accept his offer? Julian asked. Nick looked at him with a neutral expression. Things are going pretty well for me here. Julian chuckled, believing Nick had refused because he didn't want to die, like everyone else. Working for the city so suddenly could look like a betrayal of Julian, and Nick wouldn't want to take that risk. That was partially true, but not the whole picture. The bigger reason was that Nick hated the governor for the state of the city, and hated the thought of working beneath someone like him. He'd rather work for any of the Specters instead. At least they were honest about wanting to consume all of humanity. That was hyperbole, of course, but it captured his opinion of the governor well enough. Nick talked with Julian for a while. A couple of hours later, the governor returned, acting no different than usual, and asked Julian about the Specter he'd mentioned. Julian quickly showed him the spilling bottle, and they talked about it for a while. Some minutes later, the governor left with the bottle, saying he'd send it to his researchers to check its effectiveness against the forests and possibly the Crimson Sea. That would take a couple of days. Dark Dream wouldn't know what they'd get out of the trade until the researchers finished. As for the ruin, Dark Dream wasn't told anything. Most likely, people from Aegis would arrive, or had already arrived, to check it out. There wasn't much to do but wait. There was at least something interesting for Nick to handle, taking a look at their other new Specter and figuring out how to work with it. It had been over 2 years since he'd last needed to do that. Chapter 385, Talking with the New Specter. 2 days after meeting the governor, Nick went into the containment unit of their new Specter on the 3rd floor. By now, it should have recovered. He opened the door and saw the Specter standing in the middle of the room, its eyes turning to look at him. Seeing a 2.5-meter-tall figure with spider legs and pure black eyes staring from the middle of a room was scary. Even Nick was slightly creeped out. But that was about it. He wasn't afraid, since he could punch its head off if needed. That it hadn't immediately attacked showed some degree of intelligence. Specters with human shapes were often intelligent enough to reason with, though not always. The bleeding lady was a good example of the exception. "Can you understand what I'm saying?" Nick asked. Silence. The Specter just looked at him. Then its mouth opened wide, revealing a deep, dark void. "Edwin!" A terrifying scream tore out, and Nick's face scrunched up in discomfort. A moment later, the mouth closed again, and it just looked at him. "I'm taking that as a yes," Nick said, rubbing his ear. "To make things easier, I'd prefer you communicate with your spider legs or whatever those are." Scratch the floor with a left leg for a positive answer. Yes, agreement, something like that. Scratch with. Scratch. One of its right legs scratched the ground, and Nick raised an eyebrow. "That was your right leg, I assume you." Scratch. It scratched again with the right leg. Nick's brows furrowed. "Okay, seems like." Scratch. This time a left leg. "Could you stop for?" Scratch. "Right leg. Stop it or I." Scratch, scratch, scratch. Nick glared as it kept scratching the ground in an alternating pattern, eyes locked on his. He watched it for a while. About 10 seconds later, it stopped. "All right, the hard." Scratch, scratch. Nick narrowed his eyes, turned, and left the containment unit. The Specter stopped scratching and stared aimlessly forward. About a minute later, the door opened again, and Nick came back in, this time carrying something. A bucket, and a big one, completely black, almost a meter tall and nearly half a meter wide. As soon as he entered, the Specter started scratching again. Nick set the bucket down and walked toward it. Shing! In an instant, Nick exploded forward, and the 4 spider legs on its left side were cut off. Everyone! Its mouth opened again with a terrifying screech, and several strands of black silk shot out toward Nick. Bang! Nick kicked the Specter and sidestepped the silk. Bang! Its back slammed into the wall. Shing! The next instant, the legs on its other side were cut off too. Aya! Bang! Nick rammed it against the wall again, grabbed its neck and squeezed, cutting off the scream. Listen here, Nick said, deep-voiced. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Today, you're going to see what the hard way looks like. Crack! Nick tore one of its arms out of the body. Surprisingly, the Specter had stopped attacking, which made sense. It had realized it couldn't win, and continuing might provoke Nick into actually killing it. The safest option was to not resist. Nick tore off the other arm and both legs, then threw the torso and head into the corner. The two of them looked at each other for a while. I don't know if you know what manufacturers or extractors are since you were outside the city, Nick said, but we're not necessarily enemies. We want Zephyx, and you produce Zephyx as you grow stronger. Every Specter has its own way of growing, and we're interested in that. You becoming more powerful is what we want too. He gathered the severed limbs like loose pieces of metal, holding them in his arms. But if you're not cooperative, we can get our Zephyx this way too. He dumped the limbs into the bucket. S. A sound like tens of saws came from the bucket, and the limbs sticking out began to shake, shrink, and fall in. Nick watched the Specter's eyes. After about a minute, the limbs vanished completely, and the bucket went quiet again. He picked up the bucket and walked to the door. Next time, I'd like to have a normal conversation with you. If you're uncooperative, I'll do the same thing again. He opened the door and turned back. You should be good to go in another 2 days. See you then. Nick stepped out and closed the door. The Specter kept staring at the employee entrance. Silence. Then it slowly opened its mouth again. Its mouth closed. Silence. No Specter liked losing its limbs. Specters wanted to grow more powerful and survive, and losing all one's limbs weakened one's defenses, making survival harder. Sadly, there wasn't much the Specter could do. Chapter 386, The Abductor. 2 days later, Nick returned to the Specter, and this time it didn't immediately annoy him with constant scratching. It seemed finally cooperative. For the next hour, Nick asked it questions, and it answered by scratching the floor. Left scratch for positive, right for negative, both for neutral, none for uncertain. It turned out the Specter didn't know what extractors were. It had spent its entire life outside, growing stronger by slowly capturing increasingly powerful humans, which surprised Nick, since there probably weren't many newbies wandering around out there. After Nick explained manufacturers and extractors, it became even more cooperative. In the outside world, it had barely received any food. It had taken decades to grow this strong. Now it would receive regular food without even being in danger. If it had known this was the fate awaiting it, it would have given itself up voluntarily. Of course, if it could actually enter a city, it would rather stay free. But how? It was too noticeable and it couldn't disguise itself. After more conversation, Nick found out how it grew stronger. It abducted people, gaining power based on how many it kept prisoner and how strong they were. The cave where Nick had suppressed it had many cocoons on the walls, once filled with humans. The Specter had simply caught them, wrapped them in silk, hung them up, and never touched the cocoons again. The humans inside had died so long ago only dust remained. Nick made a plan to improve the Specter's use. Annoyingly, when he explained it couldn't kill the people sent to it, the Specter grew confused, angry, and annoyed. It took him almost half an hour to explain that letting its food escape would bring more food later. Since it wasn't a secret anymore, why would anyone let themselves be captured if it just killed them? Eventually it understood and agreed. While intelligent enough to hold a conversation, it wasn't the smartest Specter, though the ability to communicate at all made it the third most intelligent in Dark Dream, after the Money Sink and the Dreamer. The Bleeding Lady was also intelligent, but crazy. The Lover might be smart too, since it fed on human mentality, though its handsiness made that hard to judge. After finishing with the Specter, Nick gathered some of Dark Dream's newbies. Dark Dream had far more newbies than hatchlings, giving them plenty of downtime, and luckily their newest Specter could work with potentially endless people at once. From then on, the new Specter would capture and contain 2/3 of the newbies assigned to it, with the last third remaining free in the containment unit, since the Zephyx absorbing silk kept the captured ones from gathering any Zephyx themselves. Two would produce Zephyx while the third absorbed it, rotating regularly to keep things fair. At first Nick kept close watch, but eventually only checked in every couple of hours. The Specter proved far more useful than expected, able to train many weaker extractors simultaneously. Over the following days, Nick hired people to test the new Specter's ability. Silk. Any extractor who received it could release long, thick strands of black silk. Sadly, the silk couldn't absorb Zephyx and it only held physical form near the Specter. A few hours away, it turned to prefix, making it worthless as a material. Nick had hoped it might compete with the Fear Queen's ghost wires, but no such luck. Eventually, Nick found a fitting name, the Abductor. Its stage was late adolescent, making it one of Dark Dream's stronger Specters. Nick's days had grown busy. He delivered trash to the dung heap, checked on the Abductor, occasionally pulled newer employees off the puppy, fed the money sink, gave the screaming coffin its corpses, freed the people working with the fog, gathered all the Zephyx containers, and on top of that handled most of the executive work. Planning, personnel issues, the investigation department, guides for the Specters, profile reviews, budget reports, bookkeeping, meetings with other companies, and more. He was glad to have Taryn and Jenny handling employee management. With his experience in 24-hour workdays, he managed it all without issue. Finally, 2 weeks after his conversation with the governor, Nick heard back from the city about the spilling bottle and their reward. Chapter 387, Solace's Success. The research into the spilling bottle was finished. It reduced the forest's power. Sadly, its sludge strengthened the Crimson Sea instead of weakening it, so it couldn't be used against the sea directly. Disadvantages often carried their own advantages. Though the sludge couldn't weaken the Crimson Sea, it could make it produce a bit of Zephyx, meaning its ability could be harvested. The governor could take new recruits or advancing extractors to the sea every few months, spill some sludge in, and let them absorb the Crimson Sea's ability. The sludge needed was equivalent to barely half a gram of Zephyx, nothing for a fanatic like the Crimson Sea. The city was very interested in the spilling bottle. Julian negotiated with them for a couple of days before they reached an agreement. Another couple of weeks passed. Clank. Nick landed on a big platform on the middle layer of the inner city and looked forward. A huge building stood before him. No guards. He cleaned up his uniform and walked into the entrance hall. Mr. Nick. He looked over and saw a beautiful receptionist waiting by the stairs. He walked over and nodded in greeting. Is Mr. Nerger not here with you? She asked. He can't make it, Nick said. The governor's been informed. Oh, what a shame, she said, gesturing to the staircase. Please follow me, she added with a polite bow and friendly smile. Thank you, Nick answered. They walked up the staircase and down a hallway. Please in here, she said, opening a door and gesturing him in. Oh, Nick, welcome, Hera Marion Solace's CZE said, standing with a smile. Nick smiled back and shook her hand. Julian couldn't make it, sorry. Hera sighed and Ramona, Solace's CEO, shook her head helplessly from the table. Again, Hera asked, well, he did say he's been pretty busy. I thought as much, Ramona said. I talked to him 3 days ago. He said he was busy with something and gave me a cryptic hint. She looked at Nick. He told me we'd find out what during today's big meeting. Nick nodded and approached Ramona, who stood and greeted him with a handshake. Usually he wouldn't dare offer a handshake to someone more powerful, but the relationship between Dark Dream and Solace was close. They even had a program to exchange abilities between extractors. Nick and Julian met with Hera and Ramona regularly. After exchanging pleasantries, Nick looked to the big table in the middle of the room and met eyes with 2 women in Gemini uniforms. He nodded. They nodded back wordlessly. That was about as close as Dark Dream got to Gemini. Nick could theoretically walk over and offer a handshake without committing social suicide, since Dark Dream had Julian, a specialist, but that could be read as a power move and strain the relationship. Is Julian busy again? Nick looked to the other end of the table, at Ghosty. I'm sorry, but he's quite busy. The governor already knows, Nick answered. Ghosty chuckled. If only I had his freedom, he lamented, joking. Beside him, Herman Reichert, CEO of Ghosty's lab, smiled bitterly. Sorry, he said to Ghosty, half joking. Nick took his seat at the end of the table, beside the representatives of the common people. Today was the big meeting of the manufacturers, held this year inside Solace's building. The first time Solace had been allowed to host, thanks to their recent accomplishment. One of their specters had advanced and become an elder. After years, Solace had finally joined the big manufacturers, without even needing to capture an elder themselves. Specters grew at wildly different rates, and advancement was often slow or even impossible. Specters generally needed far more time to advance than humans, making it a poor strategy to rely on for gaining influence as a manufacturer. But Solace had lucked out. Usually, gaining a new main Specter meant rebranding. Solace decided against it because of the Specter's peculiarity. It was called the perversion, a floating panty, essentially a mixture of the dreamer and the lover, putting people to sleep and sexually torturing them in their dreams. A floating panty as a manufacturer's main symbol was a bit much. Since Solace mostly focused on their light and heat business anyway, they had a good argument for keeping their branding around the blinding light and the bright candle. Funnily enough, the perversion was one of the biggest reasons for Solace and Dark Dream's close relationship. The dreamer, the lover, and the perversion were essentially made for each other in terms of abilities. Solace was advancing rapidly, and Dark Dream was happy for them. After all, they were close allies. Chapter 388, Significant Contribution. Over the next couple of minutes, Mundus and Zarin from Anatomy arrived, throwing a glance at Nick before sitting down. A minute later, Arya Light and Vernon Melfian entered. Arya greeted everyone warmly, while Vernon gave a few people some casual words. "Oh, Julian isn't here. What a shame," Vernon said, looking at the empty seat beside Nick, then turned to his own seat and sat down without once looking at Nick. Nick had expected as much. The incident after Wintor's death had ruined his relationship with the Melfians and soured Dark Dream's relationship with Cugelblitz. Cugelblitz wasn't actively working against Dark Dream, thanks to Julian being friends with several of their shareholders and Vernon himself, but they showed little politeness either. Arya Light mostly didn't care about the drama, but Cugelblitz had to appear united in front of outsiders, so she ignored Nick too, though behind closed doors, she didn't support Vernon's vendetta. Vernon suspected Nick had a hand in his son's death, but there was no proof. Nick had been just a John back then. How could someone like that have the connections or ability to mentally manipulate an experienced veteran into position to kill Wintor? Everyone knew Nick was a naive idiot. How could he plan something like that? When Vernon shared his suspicions with Arya, she'd asked about Dark Dream's new CEO instead. Couldn't he have killed Wintor? But Vernon denied it. He knew Julian well and couldn't imagine him doing such a thing. So in the end, there was no reason to suspect Nick. Yet Vernon kept feeling it was Nick who'd killed his son. That was only part of why he hated him, though more important was that Nick had humiliated him in front of others. Vernon hadn't been humiliated like that in years. Naturally, he wanted revenge, but it had proved impossible over the last 2 years. Cugelblitz didn't allow owners to use specialists for personal matters without shareholder approval, and without a specialist, covertly assassinating Nick inside the city was impossible. He could send an expert, but risking one getting caught would cost Cugelblitz billions of credits. Then a month ago, Nick had left the city. Finally, a chance, but he'd already returned before Vernon even heard he'd left, and now Nick was constantly inside the city again. So Vernon was stuck waiting for his next chance. Someday, he'd finally get to kill Nick. A couple of minutes passed, and the last person arrived, the governor, Marcus Julius, walking to his seat at the end of the table. He greeted everyone calmly, and they returned it. "Julian couldn't come today. He's busy in Dark Dream," the governor told everyone. No one was surprised, and they shot Nick a glance. Once again, he was Dark Dream's sole representative. Nick apologized for Julian's absence. "Since we're on the topic of Dark Dream, I might as well announce a couple of things related to them," the governor said casually. Everyone turned to him with interest. If the governor was announcing it, it was probably important. "About a month ago, Dark Dream helped the city not once but twice," he said. Expressions of intrigue and interest spread across the table. Twice. Everyone had heard about the spilling bottle by now. It belonged to the city, and the city specters weren't kept secret. Learning it came from Dark Dream stung with envy. The spilling bottle was worth a lot. Its origin hadn't stayed secret long either, since the swallowing swamp had almost entirely vanished by now. Realizing the spilling bottle was the cause of that, they grew frustrated. They'd all inspected the swallowing swamp at least once, and none of them had found it. That Dark Dream could do something they couldn't annoyed them to no end. But what was the other helping hand? The spilling bottle was the first thing Dark Dream had given the city. What was the other? During their excursion, Dark Dream found a ruin from the old world, the governor said. It was like a bomb going off. Everyone stared at him in shock, even the two from anatomy. A ruin from the old world. There could be technologies in there worth incredible benefits. Ghosty especially looked interested. The ruin has been handed over to Aegis, and Aegis has already collected it. You don't need to look for it, the governor said. Collected it, Nick thought. Did they put it in their pockets and fly away? I'm pretty sure the mountain's still there. I'd have heard if it stood up and walked off. Aegis wants to express its deep gratitude to Dark Dream and is willing to support them with a significant financial contribution, the governor continued. Dark Dream has accepted the contribution and decided to reinvest it into the city with a significant purchase. In a month, Dark Dream will move into the central headquarters of the city forces in the lower layer, and the central headquarters will move into the building previously owned by the Spartans. Additionally, Dark Dream receives the adult, the talker. Chapter 389, Regular Topics. At that, everyone turned to look at Nick, each with a different expression. Hera and Ramona were excited. Mindy and Cindy were wary. Ghosty and Herman looked interested. Mundus and Zarin glanced at him neutrally. A small gleam appeared in Vernon's eyes, and Arya looked like she hadn't heard anything at all. Not only was Dark Dream getting a new building, they were getting an adult. Every extractor present knew of this one, since the city Specters weren't kept secret. Working with the talker was stressful, but it produced a good amount of Zephyx, a great Specter for veterans looking to grow stronger. Dark Dream has already told the city they'll move into their new building in a month, once the city's forces have cleared out. Expect a great number of moving Specters that day, the governor said. Guards will be sent to supervise naturally. No one said anything. Now then, onto the regular topics, the governor said, moving to the false news Specter. Ever since the parasite lost its grip on the city, the false news had become the biggest troublemaker besides the Crimson Sea, the most powerful uncontained Specter in the city, at least a fanatic, still unfound. It spread fake rumors that gained real traction. One claimed anatomy and the governor had joined forces to destroy Kugelblitz, tanking their stock price and public perception, and stirring public unrest. Another said the hospital organization was secretly shipping some patients out of the city to be processed into recovery liquid, which understandably enraged them and drew pressure on the city to act. Another claimed Ghosty was secretly a powerful Specter, manipulating everyone's minds. Rumors were usually just part of life, but these were extremely difficult to kill, even after a public statement. Over 70% of people who'd believed a rumor kept believing it. No logic or diplomacy worked on them. The false news didn't kill or injure anyone, but it caused immense financial damage. Nobody could find its source, and as always, no manufacturer had good news to report. Everyone was as clueless as last year. Next, the governor covered debilify, the debilitating sickness sweeping the city. The preventative measure anatomy introduced a couple of years ago helped somewhat. People who could afford it rarely got debilify anymore, and if they did, it lasted around 2 months instead of a lifetime. Everyone else was out of luck. Nobody in the outer city could afford it, and cases there had increased. Unlike the false news, there was actual progress to report here. Ghosty's lab had created its own preventative measure at a quarter of anatomy's price. Anatomy wasn't happy about the lost profits but couldn't push back much under the governor's severe gaze. Next came the city's expansion plans. For the past 2 years, the city had to be careful with its metal usage, but the re-established connection to the outside world had ended that concern. The governor had reopened the old iron mine 10 kilometers southwest of the city, pulling in tons of iron daily. The city was also building a large, isolated field of plants, a 2 by 2 kilometer zone in the west, walled in. Since strong extractors could carry tons of material in one trip, the steel walls took only about a month to build, necessary to keep out the slimes that would otherwise destroy the plants. Inside, recovery liquid had been sprayed on the ground with water, filling the dry dirt with life energy. Soon they'd cover the fields with plants, not for eating but for burning to produce huge amounts of ash, mostly carbon. Combined with the iron, that carbon would make steel to expand the city. Over the coming years, the city planned to cover the entire Crimson Sea. As long as there was no gap and everything stayed covered, the sea might as well not exist. Further down the line, they might even convert its container into some form of containment unit, potentially gaining a powerful Specter that produced huge amounts of Zephyx. The governor didn't know everything about the world, but he doubted many cities could contain such a massive force Specter. At the current pace of steel production, The city predicted it would take around 10 years to fully cover the Crimson Sea. With the future plans covered, the governor moved to the next matter. Since Dark Dream now had one specialist and one veteran, they were powerful enough to qualify for guard duty. From now on, Dark Dream would have to dedicate 20% of their Johns to the city at any given time. Chapter 390, The Yearly Meeting. There wasn't much Nick could do about it, since every manufacturer was required to comply. The only upside was that neither he nor Julian needed to join guard duty. Given their executive positions, Dark Dream still needed to run. Guard assignments ran in 1-month intervals, and the first shift was starting soon. Nick decided to send Clayton, Petra, and Jason for the first month. From what he'd heard, working for the city was considered boring, often preferable to dangerous. Most of the time, guards just walked around, stood at entrances, and ran errands. Sometimes they had to stay in a room, ready for an emergency that rarely came. Even better, city work meant 10-hour days, only 5 days a week, 2 days off, which was unheard of. Because of that, many extractors preferred working for the city over the manufacturers, though growing stronger was impossible since temporary guards never worked with the city's Specters. Only the temporary guards had it easy, though. Those who dedicated their lives to the city worked more, and their duties often put them at odds with powerful manufacturers. Guards rarely died, but it happened, and below the surface, plenty of dark dealings went on. Clayton, Petra, and Jason would start their guard duty once Dark Dream moved into its new building. The governor covered a few more topics, less relevant than the last. Eventually, it was Kugelblitz's turn. Their main topic was the blood tax. Since the metal shortage had ended, the blood they collected had dropped sharply, and they needed a new way to gather it. They'd already added an option to pay normal taxes in blood instead, but few accepted. People didn't like the idea, made worse by a rumor courtesy of the false news, that a human soul was tied to their blood, and losing blood meant losing part of one's soul. The governor shot down proposal after proposal, but Kugelblitz wouldn't let up. The Crimson Fungus's Zephyx output had dropped sharply, slowing their heroes' advancement. It was the only power source for all heroes, and right now barely covered Kugelblitz's own, leaving little for the governor to draw from. Of course, the governor knew this was mostly bluff. Kugelblitz still had plenty of blood, enough for comfortable advancement. But he couldn't call it out directly. These were Kugelblitz's internal matters, and forcing his way in would provoke pushback from the other manufacturers, who all wanted the government involved as little as possible in their affairs. The governor and Vernon argued for a while, without much progress expected, since these negotiations always dragged on. Kugelblitz wanted to squeeze the people dry of blood, and the governor didn't want that. But if he didn't relent somewhat, only Kugelblitz's heroes would have access to the Crimson Fungus, and within a couple of years, the heroes might not even need to unite to kill him. Arya Light alone might be enough. This was a brutal negotiation, and nobody expected results today. It was just the baseline for future talks. Anatomy raised a few topics needing little deliberation. Ghosty's lab announced new equipment again. Gemini asked questions that steered the conversation toward the idea that supporting stronger manufacturers served the city better than supporting weaker ones' finances, in other words. Everyone in the room besides the 3 normal people were experienced business people and could tell what was happening. Gemini was trying to make things harder for Solace and Dark Dream. Solace's recent advancement had probably scared them into protecting their lead. The governor shut that down quickly. He wouldn't favor one manufacturer financially without something equally valuable in return. Unfortunately for Gemini, they had no leverage with him. They weren't Kugelblitz, and they weren't Anatomy. Solace talked about their newly advanced Specter and their expanding light and heat network. Nick talked about Dark Dream's upcoming relocation. Nothing else needed discussing. With that, the yearly meeting ended, and everyone left except Nick, who stayed to talk with Ramona and Hera for a while, a good chance to hash out details of their cooperation, given how close the companies were. Eventually, he left too. Nothing of note happened over the next month. Then it was finally time for Dark Dream to move from the outer city into the inner city at last. Chapter 391, Start of the Move. I'll need you to get in there. Why? We're moving today. I know you won't try to escape, but we don't want to show you off to everyone or give other manufacturers a chance to criticize us. The money sink looked at the black cube, brows furrowed. If she entered, she wouldn't even be able to stand, but that didn't bother her much. She just wanted to know why Nick suddenly wanted her inside. Fine, she said, walking forward. Nick opened the cube and white mist poured out. This cube was built for moving Specters, essentially a portable Specter cage. The money sink dropped to all fours, crawled in, and pulled her legs to her torso. About 15 minutes or so, Nick told her before closing it. After pressing a few buttons, the cube sealed, lights and displays appearing along its side. Nick left it in the middle of the containment unit and exited through the employee entrance, then went to the console and pressed the release button. A huge alarm rang through the building, and about a minute later, the containment unit's wall opened, revealing the black cube inside. "This okay?" Nick asked the person beside him. "You may proceed," the red-haired woman said neutrally after inspecting the cube. She was a guard captain sent by the city, an expert tasked with ensuring Dark Dream properly secured their Specters for the move. "You don't need to be so uptight, Stacy," Julian said beside her. "Even if something goes wrong, I'm here to handle it." Stacy chuckled. "I know, but I still have to do my job." Nick lifted the black cube and headed for the stairs. Julian stayed put. Stacy followed Nick. On the first floor, most of Dark Dream's extractors waited for orders. Nick and Stacy ran past them, Nick still carrying the cube. After leaving the building, they jumped down to the streets and ran toward the city's southern entrance, already opened and waiting for them. Whenever a manufacturer moved into the inner city, essentially, the whole city adapted to accommodate them. Transporting several Specters into the inner city was risky. The outside air entering the lower layer left the inhabitants unhappy. But there was nothing they could do. This was a matter between the city and a big manufacturer. A large crowd had gathered at the entrance, all watching Nick and his cube with morbid curiosity. They wanted to see a Specter, even knowing how dangerous it was to be here. The inner city's guards had already been called to manage the crowd, several Johns holding citizens back. Nick and Stacy ran through the cleared path for over a kilometer before stopping in front of the central pillar, the middle of the megastructure and its biggest support, made of materials from the ruins below the city, damageable only by elders or stronger. Surprisingly, the pillar wasn't solid throughout. It had been built with a structure inside it in mind, many rooms forming the walls of a tower. Originally, the city's leadership had resided there, at the center of the city, behind its extremely sturdy walls. But once the layers formed and the powerful and important moved to the top of the megastructure, the leadership followed, leaving this huge tower as an administration office for the lower layer. Most of the rooms had gone unused, and the few in use just held documents. Guards sometimes stayed there too, and some rooms had even become party and leisure spaces. The building was simply too big for a handful of guards and administrators. The former Spartan building, by contrast, was smaller and doubled as a makeshift entrance between the inner and outer cities. Moving there meant no wasted space, easier guard access to the outer city, and easier access to the government for outer city residents. It also let the city retire 2 administration outposts in the outer city, consolidating everything into the new office inside the megastructure's walls. All told, both the city and Dark Dream were happy with the relocation. Nick looked at the entrances into the pillar, 2 small ones on the sides, about 2.5 meters high and wide, and a huge central gate, 5 meters high and nearly 10 wide. The gate stood open already, Dark Dream's guards posted beside it, holding back the crowd. Each floor of the pillar was nearly 7 meters high, turning the whole building into a collection of halls rather than rooms. Even with only 8 floors, its size made it over twice as tall as Dark Dream's old building. Chapter 392. The floors. Height wasn't the only thing bigger. The building's width was considerable too. The pillar was 100 meters in diameter, and the building inside it around 70 meters wide, still more than double Dark Dream's old building. As Nick entered through the big gate with the black cube, he glanced to the side. Stairs along the huge central hallway led to scaffolding, which led into more hallways and rooms. The first floor was technically 1 floor, but Dark Dream used it as 2. Since the ceiling was so high, they'd built a separate floor at about 3.5 meters up, nearly doubling the room count. The ground-level floor was 1A, the one halfway up was 1B. First floor housed all of Dark Dream's normal employees, offices for clerks, leisure rooms, a restaurant, a storage room for cleaning supplies, more offices, guard rooms, reception, janitor rooms, offices for the investigation department, and so on. The huge hallway branched into smaller ones leading to still more rooms. At the end of the main hallway was a big hall used as guest reception, with a central counter and benches and tables scattered around. At the very center of the building stood another pillar, about 10 meters wide, with 5 entrances, 4 leading to extractor shafts, one to stairs. Extractor shafts were wide holes running from the first floor to the 8th, letting extractors change floors quickly by jumping wall to wall much faster than stairs. Nick passed the reception desk and approached one of the shaft's closed doors, holding his left hand to a display beside it. His fingerless glove held a piece of metal used to identify the wearer. The Spartans had used a similar system in their building. The display changed, showing 8 numbers. Nick clicked the number 2. The door opened. He grabbed the black cube and stepped aside. "Second floor," he said, gesturing. Stacy walked through wordlessly and jumped. Nick followed, finding himself in a shaft about 2 meters wide and almost 80 meters high. About 7 meters up, an open door waited. Bang! Nick jumped and landed easily in the doorway. Bang! The door closed and locked behind him. Now on the second floor, Nick looked around. Compared to the first, it seemed almost empty. The first 10 meters from the shaft exit held nothing but floor, then walls with a handful of doors, 8 in total, each leading to a containment unit. Every floor had space for 8 containment units, or up to 16 if stacked, though Dark Dream had decided against stacking for now. With the first and 8th floors not meant for Specters, that left 6 floors, 48 containment units, expandable to 96 if needed. Far more than the measly 20 of their old building. Nick decided to distribute the Specters similarly to Cujoblitz. The 2nd and 3rd floors were for strong Specters without dangerous mind powers. The 4th was for possession Specters. The 5th was for training, the hatchlings, plus manageable adolescents like the abductor. The 6th was for force Specters. The 7th was for Specters with mental powers. The 8th was for Nick, Julian, and meetings with other manufacturers. Nick kept several strong Specters on the 2nd and 3rd floors as a buffer, in case anyone tried to reach the weaker ones, or a weak one somehow escaped. An escapee could only try to break through toward the bottom, and with Julian on the 8th floor, nothing was getting past him. Looking around, Nick still wasn't used to how bright the walls were. Dark Dream's new building used the same light technology as the megastructure's walls. Sunlight captured and infused into special Zephyx treated metal, which transported it and released bits along the way, leaving the walls shimmering. Luckily, the sun's light was already weak, so it was even weaker here. Still, with every surface shining, it felt strange. No shadows anywhere, since there was no unlit surface to cast one onto. Nick eventually walked to a door and used the console beside it. A loud alarm thundered through the building, and a minute later the wall split, revealing an open containment unit behind it. He walked in, set down the black cube, walked out and closed the wall. Then he went in through the employee entrance and opened the cube. "We're here, you can come out," he told the money sink. Chapter 393, Moving Specters. The money sink crawled out, looked around, and stood in the middle of the room. It looked just like her old home. "I'll be back tomorrow with some money. See you," Nick said, grabbing the black cube. She glanced at him for a second, then looked away wordlessly. Outside, Nick showed the cube to Stacy, who inspected it to make sure no Specters were hiding in or near it. "All right, get the next one," she said. Nick nodded, and the two jumped down to the first floor, left the building, left the inner city, and returned to Dark Dream. The first Specter was done. Nick went to the 3rd floor and entered a containment unit, immediately met with excited barking. The puppy. He smiled slightly. "We're going to move you today. Come on, get in the box," he said, gesturing at the cube. The puppy eyed it fearfully. "It's only for a couple of minutes," Nick said. It looked at him with hurt in its watery eyes. His smile vanished. "Get in the box," he said flatly. It whimpered and approached slowly. "Get inside or I will throw you inside," Nick said darkly. It stepped back fearfully, looked at the cube again, then finally crept in like it was walking to its execution. Nick closed the cube, left through the employee entrance, opened the big door, grabbed the cube, and showed it to Stacy. Then the two ran back to Dark Dream's new building. This time Nick carried it to the 7th floor. The puppy had lived on the 3rd floor before, being a physical Specter, but Nick moved it to the 7th, the floor for dangerous mental abilities. In a couple of years, it would become an adult, likely evolving an ability to manipulate people even more effectively. Nick didn't want to take chances with it. It looked harmless and cute, which was exactly what made it dangerous. After delivering the puppy, Nick grabbed the next Specter. "I know you just moved in, but you gotta move again," he told the big man with spidery limbs. The man looked at the small cube, then back at Nick, clearly about to protest that he wouldn't fit. "You fit in there," Nick said calmly. "You're not walking to your new home beside me. Either you get in the box yourself or I cut you into pieces and store you that way. Your choice." The abductor stared at him. Nick stared back neutral. Then the man opened his mouth. Everyone. Nick just looked at him like nothing happened. The man closed his mouth, then slowly climbed into the cube. Not easy, but he managed to fold himself in completely. Nick closed it and carried it to Dark Dream's new building, placing the abductor on the 5th floor, the training floor. We're moving, Nick told the next Specter. I know it's uncomfortable, but you gotta get in the box for a couple of minutes. After that you get your new room, though it's white, so you'll want to repaint. A woman with scarlet hair and wounds across her body sat in the corner, legs tucked to her chest. I kill you, she said quietly. No, we're not cutting right now, Nick said. We gotta move you to your new place. I'll send Larry to work with you later, all right? I heard you like working with him. The bleeding lady rocked back and forth a bit. Come on, we have to go, Nick said. A few seconds later her legs extended, and she crawled forward, pulling herself with her arms while her legs dragged behind, leaving a red trail of blood. She crawled into the cube and returned to her sitting position. Just about 5 minutes, Nick said. I kill you, she whispered. Nick closed the cube and carried it off. Hey Larry, I need you, he said in Dark Dream's old main hall. Huh, Larry asked surprised. What's up, boss? I promised the bleeding lady you'd work with her if she complied. Can you come with me later and do that? I don't want her throwing a tantrum. Oh, Larry said, sure, no problem. Thanks, Nick said. Nick, Larry, and Stacy went to the 2nd floor of the new building. Larry followed Nick into the new containment unit, and Nick opened the cube. How did you already color it red? Nick asked, surprised at the red staining the inside. The bleeding lady crawled out and immediately locked onto Larry. Hi, Larry said with a smile. I kill you, she said loudly, crawling toward him. You two have fun. I gotta go, Nick said, leaving with the empty cube. He showed it to Stacy again, but this time she frowned. It's contaminated. You need to clean this. Nick sighed, sure. Chapter 394, Final Specters. This good? Nick asked for the 10th time or so. Stacy inspected the cube closely. Good enough, she said after a bit. Nick sighed. He'd scrubbed it so many times, cleansing liquid, regular cleaner, even recovery liquid for some reason. Larry had even passed by, already done with the bleeding lady. Finally, Nick and Stacy went for the next Specter. Get in the box, we're putting you in a new containment unit, Nick ordered, pointing at the cube. Slap. Nick slapped a tentacle away. No, we're not doing that right now. Slap, slap. More tentacles slapped away. Want me to force you into the box? Slap. Okay, that's it. Nick grabbed the tentacle-filled worm and threw it into the cube. Bang. He closed it, locking the lever inside. He really didn't like that Specter. Nick carried it to the 7th floor of the new building. Bang. As soon as the cube opened, he grabbed the worm and threw it against the wall. It wriggled, then slowly started approaching him again, tentacles reaching. Nick left the containment unit quickly with the cube. We're moving into a new building, and I can't just let you fly around outside, Nick told the next Specter. You gotta go into the box. The dreamer looked at the cube, flapped its wings lightly, and landed smoothly inside plenty of room, given its size. Nick closed the cube and brought it to the 7th floor. 0 issues. Xiang xiang. Nick grabbed a bloody chunk and chucked it into the cube before closing it. This was the Blood Hawk. He didn't even try to communicate, just cut it into pieces and grabbed the biggest chunk with the core. It went to the 5th floor, and the cube needed scrubbing again afterward. Next, Nick carefully cut the blood horse down to a size that barely fit the cube. It was big, and shrinking it down wasn't easy. Like the Blood Hawk, it went to the 5th floor. After more scrubbing, Nick grabbed the glasses, a possession Specter, so transport was easy, and put it on the 4th floor, followed by the can, also to the 4th floor. Only 3 Specters remained, none of which could be moved by cube. Nick set the cube aside and grabbed some Zephyx suppressors, entering a containment unit to wrap them around the motionless, screaming coffin. It had just eaten that morning, but he still had to be careful. Since it couldn't be folded, it didn't fit the cube and had to be moved another way. Luckily, it wasn't worth much, and everyone already knew about it from the last move. This time Stacy made sure there were no issues with the suppressors. The inner city citizens finally got to see an actual Specter instead of just black cubes. The coffin on Nick's back drew stares of wonder. This was a Specter. In the new building, Nick placed the screaming coffin on the 4th floor and removed the suppressors. 2 Specters left. Okay, these 2 will be troublesome, Nick said. One's a force specter, the other acts like a mix of force and possession. Both are big. Nick fixed one of the expensive Specter cages to the fog's containment unit on the 6th floor. Moving force Specters was always risky, and the city required Nick to keep several extractors ready to suppress it if anything went wrong. They didn't want another Crimson Sea incident. The Gemini trio, Clayton, Petra, and Jason, all followed Nick, their abilities suited to suppressing force Specters. Luckily, the expensive containment unit and cage proved worth the money, and nothing went wrong. The fog was pushed into the cage by the containment unit, and the cage was moved out through a removable wall. The new building's ceiling was high enough, and parts of the floor were removable for exactly this purpose. The fog settled into its new 6th-floor containment unit without issue. Finally, the most problematic Specter of all. Who would have thought the dung heap would be this troublesome to move? The biggest issue was that it wasn't housed in a containment unit built for force Specters, so they had to suppress it manually. 10 Dark Dream employees gathered in front of the containment unit, with several city guards on standby. The only way to move it was to get it out of its unit first, then suppress it again. It was too big, and no container that could hold it fit through the employee entrance. As soon as the door opened, an abhorrent stench hit everyone, and a slime-like substance flowed out. Nick charged forward and grabbed it, despite acting like a possession and force Specter. The dung heap was actually physical, so he could grab it directly. He hauled it into the prepared Specter cage, then pushed past it, left the cage, and kicked it until it fit. Bang, the door closed. The dung heap was in the cage, but it came at a price. Everyone kept their distance, looking at Nick with disgust. He didn't smell great right now. Luckily, it was the last Specter, so which floor would it go to? Surprisingly, the 6th, the force Specter floor, and into a containment unit built for force Specters. Nick suspected the dung heap might transform into a true force Specter someday. What if it lost its slime-like body and became actual liquid as an adult? Then it could break out of a normal containment unit, so he housed it accordingly. He was not happy about that at all. Not only did the dung heap deliver almost no Zephyx, now they had to contain it in a unit worth millions of credits. If not for its ability, Nick would have sold this shitty Specter long ago. He hated the dung heap. Chapter 395, Funny Name. And that's it, one of 2 guards standing in front of one of Dark Dream's containment units said. Thank you, Nick said. Just doing our job, the other guard said. Do you know what to do with him? I do, Nick answered. Then I'd tell you to have fun, but we both know that won't happen, one guard said with a laugh, and the 2 walked toward the extractor shafts. Nick followed to escort them out. The stairs and shafts were locked by default, and guards couldn't leave without an escort. At the shafts, they turned toward the stairs instead. Extractors often preferred not to use another manufacturer's shafts. Nick swiped his hand over the console, and the stairwell door opened. Unlike the stairwell in the old building, this one had no central hole, no way to jump quickly between floors. At the 1st floor, Nick opened the door with his identification again, led the 2 guards out, said his goodbyes, and went back in. Accessing or leaving the stairwell required identification, mainly for security, to keep people from wandering into places they didn't belong. Someone who snuck into the stairwell could travel between the 1st and 6th floors, but couldn't leave without proper ID. Notably, there was a divider between the 6th and 7th floors, since Specters with dangerous mental powers lived on the 7th. Those Specters could manipulate normal people, so the divider kept normal people out and kept anyone already under their influence from reaching them. Nick entered the extractor shaft and went to the 3rd floor, where only one containment unit was currently active. He took a deep breath and approached. The city had already told him everything about this Specter, and he knew what to do, though he wasn't looking forward to it. If he had to rate it out of 10, danger 3, money 7, annoyance 8. As long as one stayed sharp, this Specter was essentially harmless. Lose focus, though, and you'd be in trouble. Luckily, being inside a containment unit gave an extractor a good chance to escape if things went wrong, assuming they were on the talker's level. Everything's already been handled, Nick thought. For the next 8 hours, nothing should go wrong. I have to get used to working with it. The talker will be my only real way to advance going forward. He took a deep breath and sighed. No pain, no gain, I suppose. Nick opened the door. The talker stood revealed. A brightly smiling young man with blonde hair, a clean white shirt and black trousers, a professional look, undercut by a bright, charismatic smile that gave him the aura of someone who got along with everyone. Easy to picture him strolling the streets, laughing and joking with strangers, handing out compliments. In short, everyone's friend. Nick entered quickly and shut the door. "Oh hey," the man said, surprised. "You're a new face, I haven't seen you before." He approached slowly. Nick stood still. "Hello." "Hi," the man laughed, then coughed. "Sorry, I haven't introduced myself." He offered his hand with a friendly smile. "Hi, the name's Jade, Jesse Jameson Jonathan Jenkins. Mouthful, I know, just call me Jade." "Yes, hello, my name is Nick said, shaking his hand slowly and carefully. Nick, JJ repeated, then burst out laughing. "That's one hell of a name, how'd you come by it?" "Well," Nick started and trailed off. The next moment he felt JJ's grip tighten, his body straining slightly like it was flexing with power. His eyes bored intensely into Nick's. "I'm an orphan, and I didn't really have a name back then." As Nick narrated his past, JJ relaxed, grip loosening, body easing, eyes unfocusing. "And you stuck with Nick?" he asked with a laugh. "What else was I supposed to do?" Nick said, shrugging. "I'd already introduced myself that way in front of every powerful person in the city. It was ride or die." JJ laughed. "Naming yourself Nick, that's hilarious. Ever think about changing it since then?" "Not really," Nick said. "It isn't really an issue." "How come? Most people would struggle with a name like that." "Well," Nick said, "to me, a name isn't that important. It's just a way for others to refer to you. I'm still me. I don't think it has much influence on who I am." "That's an interesting viewpoint," JJ said. "Why do you think other people put so much weight on their names then?" "I think other people view their names as a representation." The conversation continued. Chapter 396, The Talker. "It's like a big grayish-white stone. You'll usually see a couple of guards standing around it." "Huh, why are guards standing around the rust lick?" JJ asked. "Salt's necessary to survive, and people in the outer city often forget to get enough. Inner city food has a lot of added salt, but outer city food doesn't." "Why don't they use salt in their food? I heard it tastes good," JJ asked. "Mostly money problems. Salt's expensive." "Why's the salt so expensive?" JJ asked. Nick's eyes felt hard to focus, his vision blurring. How long had he been at this? He didn't know. He'd set the timer to 8 hours before entering, and since the alarm hadn't rung yet, it couldn't have been longer. How much had he said in the past few hours? He was sure he'd never said this many words in a single day. This is going to be my life now, Nick thought, still talking about the characteristics of salt. This was how one worked with the talker. It grew more powerful by socially exhausting people, demanding constant attention, a smooth and endless conversation. When it asked a question, it wanted an answer. Surprisingly, the answer didn't need to reflect true thoughts or beliefs. Lying was fine, as long as it wasn't too obvious and didn't contradict itself later. While talking to it, one wasn't allowed a moment to relax or gather one's thoughts. No drinking, eating, sleeping, or getting distracted. The talker wanted a high-quality conversation demanding full attention. Stop talking or give short, curt answers and you'd regret it. It started by lightly slapping the other person's face. If they didn't return to normal conversation, it escalated, tearing out fingernails, punching, tearing off limbs. It only lost interest once it was clear no amount of torture would make the person talkative again. That was the only outcome. As a Specter, the talker had no real needs, no hunger, thirst, exhaustion, boredom. It could keep talking for years without a break. Humans couldn't. Normal humans needed to eat, sleep, drink, and even Extractors eventually grew too exhausted to keep talking. The only silver lining. The talker was excellent at keeping a conversation going with constant questions, so the human never ran out of topics. The idea of a constantly talking Specter might sound funny, until you were actually forced to talk for hours without a break, especially once it started physically torturing you. People who'd fallen victim to the talker carried lifelong damage. Many lost limbs. Those who recovered physically became much quieter afterward. Becoming its victim was not funny. Ding! A high-pitched bell sounded from one of the walls. Nick felt like he'd been saved. "Oh, that was an interesting sound. What does it mean?" JJ asked. "It's an alarm. Our time's up, I have to go," Nick said. "Come on, we only just started," JJ said with a chipper laugh. "We can talk some more. We'll see each other later. I'll have to work with you again after all. I'm leaving now and you won't be able to stop me," Nick said, stepping toward the employee entrance. No, JJ said, shaking his head, stepping forward too. "This conversation is great, we can't just stop." Nick said nothing and touched the door. He looked at JJ. JJ looked back. Crack! Blades exploded out of JJ's hands, and he charged at terrifying speed. Bang! Nick drew his own blades and parried. JJ was an early adult, the same level as Nick, but Nick's body was more powerful from constant training. JJ's blades were knocked aside, leaving his torso open. Boom! Nick kicked his chest, sending him flying across the containment unit. Bang! JJ's back hit the wall. In the same instant, Nick opened the door and left, closing it before JJ could recover and reach him. As soon as the door closed, JJ stopped his charge instantly. In one fluid motion, his blades vanished and the torn parts of his suit repaired themselves. He walked to the middle of the containment unit and stood there, looking forward with a charming smile. Silence. JJ didn't say or do anything. He just waited for his next conversation. Outside, Nick took a deep breath. He'd known this was coming, but fighting an adult was still nerve-wracking. This was going to be every day from now on. The talker was undeniably intelligent, but not sane. No matter how many times it happened, it would always attack if he tried to end the conversation. No argument or pleading would change that. For a while, Nick just stared aimlessly forward. His mind could finally relax for the first time in 8 hours. He was so happy to do nothing, just look forward, think about nothing, allow himself, for once, to do absolutely nothing. It was so relaxing. Chapter 397, Perception. Time continued to pass. Julian kept teaching Nick things, though the lessons had grown less frequent. By now much of what Julian taught was advanced and only useful in specific scenarios, how material could be influenced with Zephyx, for instance. Nice to know, but how would it help Nick? Dark Dream wasn't trying to enter that market. The essentials, negotiating, treating employees, reading people, handling money, had already been covered. Nick wasn't as skilled a negotiator as Vernon or Zarin Harrow, but he'd already surpassed most business owners in the lower layer of the inner city. There wasn't much more Julian could teach him. Opportunities had also grown scarcer, thanks to their new building's location. Since it sat in the middle of the lower layer of the inner city, powerful people occasionally walked by. That wasn't an issue with experts or weaker, but Julian had to be careful around specialists and the occasional hero. Level 5 Extractor's senses were terrifyingly sharp. A specialist 100 meters away could hear the faint vibration of Dark Dream's first-floor ceiling, and with their speed of thought could pin down the location, speed, and weight of someone walking on the second floor. Because of that, Julian couldn't blanket the whole building with his mouths anymore. He made sure not to extend them past the third floor. A hero's senses were even sharper, but couldn't stretch further into the building thanks to its thick walls. Unless a hero stood right in front of it, they couldn't sense anything above the third floor, though standing right in front, they could sense all the way to the 6th floor and higher. Julian had to stay careful while in the inner city. Luckily, since Julian himself was effectively a specialist, he could sense the entire building even while his actual body stayed on the 8th floor most of the time. Thanks to the building's absurd defenses, Julian no longer needed to stay inside constantly. In the old building, any veteran or expert could have silently cut through a wall and entered. Not here. A powerful expert could get through the walls eventually, but it would take a long time and be insanely loud, forcing them through the entrance instead. That meant Julian could leave and stay outside as long as he could still sense Dark Dream's entrance, letting him meet other business owners in person. Another upside, Nick didn't need to talk to Julian as often. Julian could sense him but couldn't shout across floors, and Nick was thankful for that. He had zero interest in talking to anyone right now. Every day, Nick worked with the talker for 8 hours. It was ridiculously exhausting, and work always piled up during his absence. The first few days had nearly broken him, but after a couple of weeks he got used to it. The saving grace was that the talker didn't seem to remember old conversations. It kept asking Nick's name every time they met, as if it only had short-term memory. That made things far easier, since as long as Nick answered the same way, the conversations played out identically, settling into a repetitive rhythm that was far less exhausting. It also never learned new ways to attack him, always unveiling its blades and trying to pin his arms. Nick just parried and kicked it into the far wall. After several weeks, he found an even better trick. As long as he kept casually talking while walking away, the talker wouldn't stop him. He'd open the door mid-sentence, step through, close it, and go silent. It only turned aggressive once it lost sight of him. By then, the door was already shut. The tactic took a lot of practice to pull off cleanly, but it made things much easier. Nick worked with the talker from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. every day, and afterward always collected the Zephyx from every containment unit, starting with the talker, usually the biggest source, though not always, since other Specters occasionally outproduced it. Nick walked to the wall and removed a plate. After entering the code, a small door opened, revealing 3 Zephyx containers. Only the left one held anything. 237 grams, he said, checking the display attached to the container before pulling it out. He'd bought these containers with attached displays specifically, so he wouldn't have to write down each amount by hand. He pulled a box from the side, set the container into a padded slot, closed the box and carried it off. Chapter 398, How Much Money in a Day? Nick went to the second floor for those containers too. The money sink had produced 167 grams today. The bleeding lady, around 115. On the fourth floor, pulling the container from the glass's containment unit sent white crystals showering into a second container. Someone was currently working with it, and the units were designed to start filling a new container as soon as one was pulled. The glasses produced about 95 grams a day, a fixed amount since it couldn't grow stronger, as long as a mid-John or better worked it. The Ken gave 0 grams today, since it wasn't worked every day, sometimes up to 60, usually 0 or 20. The screaming coffin gave about 8 grams. Nick remembered when 8 grams had seemed like a lot. On the fifth floor, the abductor delivered about 67 grams. It could produce far more, but Nick used it mainly to train new employees rather than squeeze maximum output with a few dedicated Johns. Dark Dream simply had too few Johns for the number of adolescents it held. The Blood Hawk gave 5 grams, the Blood Horse 8. On the sixth floor, the Dung Heap gave 37 grams, sadly low. It was one of the few Specters limited by available food rather than Zephyx capacity. With access to 100 tons of food, it could probably hit a full kilogram a day. But Nick had no such supply, and refused to buy edible food, since that would drive up food prices and hurt normal people. So he settled for 20 to 40 grams a day. The neighboring containment unit, the Fog, gave 189 grams good money, but it demanded constant attention from 3 Johns working 24-hour shifts with 2 rest days after. Still, it always produced well. On the 7th floor, with the abductor now available, newbies no longer worked the puppy, so its output had risen, 142 grams today, though it too needed 3 dedicated Johns. The Lover gave 105 grams today, though the number varied wildly. Only Carrie worked with it, and output depended on how many sessions he put in, ranging from about 50 to 140 grams. Dreamer gave 212 grams. Its daily output ranged between 180 and 250, though that number was a bit misleading. It only reflected what the containment unit absorbed. Since the Dreamer gave Dark Dream 75% of its Zephyx instead of the standard 90%, its true production was much higher. Partly because it was Dark Dream's only peak adolescent, partly because it simply produced a lot. At 90%, it could theoretically hit 300 grams a day, the only Specter capable of outproducing the Talker. But there was a catch in that comparison. The Dreamer was worked 24 hours a day at full efficiency, while the Talker was only worked 8. If Nick had the time, or Dark Dream had more veterans, working at 3 times as much could yield 600 to 700 grams a day. Naturally, as a peak adolescent, the Dreamer still couldn't match an early adult like the Talker at equal hours. After adding that container to the box, Nick went to the 8th floor and tallied everything. 1,387 grams of Zephyx, the equivalent of 1.387 million credits. That wasn't pure profit though. Deliveries, normal employees, extractors, executives, team leaders, food waste, and the credits dumped into the money sink all came out of that. After general costs, Dark Dream was left with about 1.1 million credits. About 10% went to the city as taxes, leaving a bit less than a million. Extractors collectively received 100,000 credits. The 2 team leaders got about 25,000 each, 50,000 total. Nick earned around 50,000 from his position, plus a share from working with Specters directly, like the team leaders. Julian got 200,000. The remaining 600,000 stayed with the company for equipment, new containment units and other needs, or simply accumulating otherwise. Dark Dream was earning a lot now. Every day, over 1 million credits in revenue. Chapter 399, 18 months. More time passed, and after around 18 more months, Nick became a mid-veteran. He'd been an extractor for 9 years now, already a mid-veteran. Becoming one this quickly was unheard of. Most people who managed it did so in their late 30s or 40s. Nick was 25. Yet not much else had happened in those 18 months. Dark Dream hadn't caught another Specter. It felt stagnant, especially since Nick had done little but work. Still, there were no shortcuts to growing stronger. Becoming a mid-veteran at 25 was already unprecedented in Crimson City, over 5 years younger than the previous record holder. Sadly, Nick still had to invest years into every level, and it would only get worse. His pace of advancement already bordered on suspicious. Going any faster risked the city investigating Dark Dream thoroughly enough to uncover Julian's secret. There were no treasures, herbs, or potions that could rapidly boost someone's level. The fastest method was working with Specters and consuming more Zephyx by inhaling or eating it, though the latter had little effect and was expensive. So while Dark Dream looked slow and stale to outsiders, experienced manufacturers could tell it was rapidly growing more powerful, especially its employees. Dark Dream now had 2 peak Johns, with Taryn joining that rank. Jenny was still too early to attempt Zephosis. She needed more Zephyx first. Beyond that, Dark Dream now had 7 late Johns, far more than before, plus 4 mid-Johns and 6 initial Johns, 19 Johns total, over double what they'd had before the Crimson Sea broke out, and each one stronger than before. They also had 17 newbies of various levels, roughly matching Solace's count. A healthy supply of newbies meant a healthy supply of weak Specters, ensuring a steady pipeline of new employees. For a manufacturer, raising your own extractors was always preferable to hiring from elsewhere. Outside hires carried the risk of spies, plus a fee owed to their current employer. Unemployed extractors were best avoided entirely. Every manufacturer invested heavily in raising them, and a company willing to burn that investment by firing someone usually had good reason. It was extremely rare for an unemployed extractor to get hired elsewhere. Their only real recourse was contracting for the city. None of the perks real guards got, plenty of the work, and horrendous pay. Still better than nothing. Even horrendous pay by extractor standards was enough to live comfortably in the lower layer of the inner city. So having plenty of hatchlings and adolescents to produce fresh recruits mattered a great deal. Employees weren't the only thing growing fast. The Specters were too. The talker had already become a mid-adult, though that had little to do with Nick. It had been close to advancing when Dark Dream acquired it, and its next advancement would take years. Dark Dream also gained 2 more peak adolescents in the Fog and the Abductor. The Bleeding Lady, Dung Heap, and Money Sink were late adolescents, and the rest were mid-adolescents, no early or initial adolescents at all, since Dark Dream hadn't caught many new Specters lately. Luckily, the Puppy and the Fog were easy enough to give the initial and early Johns work. The takeaway was clear: Dark Dream needed time. Everyone and everything was advancing, but they needed more of it to produce stronger extractors and Specters. Given time, several adolescents would become adults, and several Johns would become veterans. But Nick didn't have that time. At least he didn't want it. Dark Dream needed more adolescents. Right now the ratio between adolescents and Johns was fine, but it would tilt as some adolescents became adults and more newbies became Johns. Nick also needed another powerful adult. He and the talker were at the same level now, but once Nick became a late veteran, that would change. The talker would still be nowhere near a late adult, making Nick's next advancement much harder. 2 additional mid-veterans might have let the talker keep pace, but that wasn't the case. As things stood, the talker would need roughly a decade to reach late adult. Nick didn't want to wait that long, mainly because of Julian, who was also advancing. He hadn't leveled up yet, but was close. In 5 years he'd become an early fanatic. If Nick didn't keep pace, he might not survive it. Would Julian keep him alive once he controlled the entire city? Of course not. So Nick decided to go all in on growing Dark Dream. He needed it to grow rapidly if he wanted to keep his own pace of advancement. He decided to do something drastic, go on another excursion, but not with Dark Dream this time. With Solace. Chapter 400, Roles. We're here to meet Mr. Nick, a smaller blonde man told Dark Dream's receptionist. We're the team from Solace. He should be expecting us. Of course, she said politely. Please give me a short moment. I'll get him right away. She walked off toward the stairs. The 3 people at the desk waited in silence, expressions neutral. About a minute later, she returned with a tall, muscular man, Nick. The 3 had seen him before, though only one had actually talked to him. Hey Carl, Nick said, nodding to the smaller blonde man. I presume we're going now. Carl nodded back. He wore Solace's uniform and carried no visible weapon, not that this made him harmless, far from it. He was Solace's second expert and the only one besides their CZE Haramarian, though he'd only become an expert 4 years ago and was still at the initial level. Advancing within the expert stage took a lot of time and effort. Carl was Solace's vice CZE, responsible for gathering new Specters. He and Nick had talked a few times before. "Yes, we're going soon," Carl said neutrally. "Let me introduce the team." He pointed to a tall, thin man with long, unkempt black hair and a certain coldness in his eyes, a rifle nearly as long as him on his back. Nick could tell immediately this was an experienced fighter, expected, since these three were Solace's main force for capturing Specters, responsible for nearly 20% of their catches. "This is Irwin, our sniper and sensor. He's a peak veteran," Carl said. "Since you insisted our abilities stay confidential, that's all I can tell you." "Hi," Irwin said, distant and neutral. Nick nodded. Carl pointed to a brown-haired man of average build, two guns holstered at his sides, eyeing Nick with a skeptical raised brow. "This is Mark, our manipulator, mid-veteran." "Hey," Mark said with a nod. Nick nodded back. Carl turned to his teammates and pointed at Nick. "This is Nick, mid-veteran, and he's a sensor, an assassin, and a runner." The other two grimaced with disbelief. Someone who filled all three roles. Sure, right. These were roles used to categorize fighters during group missions, adopted by every manufacturer in Crimson City except Dark Dream, which hadn't bothered yet, having only run one excursion into the outer world. There were 10 roles in general. A bruiser engaged enemies directly without dying to a quick hit, buying time for the rest of the team. Clayton, Dark Dream's shield bearer, was a good example. Despite his weaponless, slight build, Carl actually filled this role for his team. A sniper took enemies out from range. Jenny was a good Dark Dream example. A manipulator affected the battlefield without dealing much direct damage, Fields of Darkness, pulling or pushing enemies, distorting the surroundings. An assassin closed distance quickly and killed. Nick was a good example. A sensor could scan the surroundings for threats. Nick again, given his ability to sense whether someone could see him. A runner excelled at escaping. That might sound unimportant, but in certain situations it was the most crucial role of all. If a runner escaped, the attack would be exposed and the attackers prosecuted, since attacking other extractors was highly illegal. Most attacking parties fled the moment a runner got away. If a powerful guard or the governor showed up, they'd be captured alive, exposing which manufacturer was responsible. A healer could restore someone's vitality or Zephyx. The Spartan who'd helped a teammate recover Zephyx during the attack on Nick was a good example. A suppressor exhausted and suppressed enemies. Clayton, Petra, and Jason from Nick's last excursion were good examples, all carrying the Money Sink's ability to drain an enemy's Zephyx. Suppressors were essential against 4 Specters. An informant extracted information through their ability. Jenny, with the dreamer's power to look into someone's dreams, counted as one. The last role, charmingly named whatever, covered anything that didn't fit the other 9. Most extractors could only fill one role. A few could manage 2. Anyone claiming 3 was probably exaggerating or lying. Nick could fill 3, but the others found that hard to believe. A skill set that diverse usually meant mediocrity at all of them. In fact, none of his 3 new teammates believed him. But they kept quiet. Nick was Dark Dream's CZE, and ruining the relationship between the 2 manufacturers wasn't worth it.